The Sovereign of Kyoto. Act 4. Chapter 15. The message reached the hero faction's leadership faster than anyone at the shrine expected, and the response, when it came, was not an immediate counterattack. It was silence. A full week passed without any reported activity along the boundary, no probing, no scouting, none of the low-level testing that had characterized the months before the winter assault. Shinra called it the most informative silence he had observed in his long career studying the organization's patterns. They are reassessing, he told Issei and Yasaka, during a morning briefing in the study, the winter sun bright and cold through the paper screens. An organization with the hero faction's particular institutional culture does not simply absorb a defeat of that magnitude without reconsidering its fundamental assumptions. The operatives who returned will have filed reports. Those reports will have moved up whatever command structure the organization currently maintains. And somewhere in that structure, people are now asking themselves whether the assumptions that justified this campaign in the first place still hold. You think they might actually stop, Issei said, though something in his tone suggested he was testing the idea rather than believing it outright. I think it is possible they pause, reconsider, and shift their resources toward easier targets for a time. I do not think it is likely they abandon the broader campaign entirely. Organizations built around a singular ideological mission rarely abandon that mission simply because one operation failed expensively. Shinra's expression was carefully balanced between hope and caution, the particular expression of a man who had survived enough disappointments to distrust comfort but who also recognized when comfort was, to some degree, earned. What I believe we have purchased, with the events of that night, is time. Possibly months. Possibly longer, if the diplomatic framework with the three factions continues to develop in the direction it has been moving. Time to strengthen further. Time to build alliances that make any future attempt even less attractive than this one proved to be. Time is good, Yasaka said. Time is something we can use well. The weeks that followed bore this out. The bilateral agreement with the Gremory House, formalized through several rounds of careful correspondence that Issei found himself reading with a complicated mixture of professional interest and the particular distance of someone reviewing documents related to a chapter of his life that had closed cleanly enough not to ache when reopened. The three factions' shared intelligence framework began producing actual results within the first month, reports from Devil Border Patrols about hero faction movement patterns that, cross-referenced with the Yokai faction's own observations, painted a picture of an organization that had, indeed, redirected significant resources elsewhere, apparently toward a smaller, less defended community in the Chugoku region that Shinra noted, with grim concern, fit the exact profile of isolated, allyless targets that had characterized the historical pattern. We should warn them, Issei said immediately, when this came up. We are already in the process of doing so, Shinra told him. Azazel's network identified the pattern roughly the same time we did, and reached out through fallen angel channels. The community in question, a settlement of Tanuki and a smaller population of Kappa, has historically been even more isolated than we were, with essentially no outside contact at all. He paused. I would like to suggest, Issei, that this represents an opportunity. Not merely to warn them, but to offer the kind of support we ourselves needed 4 months ago. A direct demonstration of what the alliance network we have begun building can actually provide, beyond the abstract value of agreements on paper. Issei looked at Yasaka, who was already nodding slowly, the particular quality of her expression suggesting she had arrived at the same conclusion through her own reasoning before Shinra had finished articulating it. You want to send help, Issei said. I want to send you, Yasaka said. If you are willing. A direct intervention, the Guardian of Kyoto extending protection to a community under threat before that threat fully materializes, would accomplish several things at once. It would protect people who deserve protecting. It would demonstrate, concretely, what alliance with the Yokai faction actually means in practice, which is worth more than any number of formal agreements. And it would establish a precedent, Issei, for exactly the kind of regional cooperation that the historical pattern Shinra found in the archive suggests has always been the missing piece in stopping campaigns like this one before they succeed. Issei thought about this, the weight of it settling into him with the particular gravity of decisions that mattered beyond the immediate moment. I'd want Kuroka with me, he said. She's seen what these devices look like in 3 different locations now. If they're starting the same pattern in Chugoku, she'd recognize it faster than anyone. I had assumed as much, Yasaka said, with the faint warmth of someone who appreciated being predictable in exactly the way that mattered. He found Kuroka in the training yard, working through a sequence of forms with 2 of the younger shrine guardians, her movements precise and economical in the cold morning air, breath misting around her with each exhale. She caught sight of him approaching and ended the session with a brief instruction to her students, then crossed the yard to meet him, her expression already attentive in the way it became when she sensed something had shifted. Chugoku, he said without preamble, because that was a habit they had built between them over the past weeks, the dispensing with unnecessary preliminaries in favor of direct information. A Tanuki and Kappa settlement, isolated, no outside alliances. The pattern matches what happened here, and what you described from Tohoku. We think the hero faction is moving resources there. Kuroka's expression sharpened immediately, the careful stillness of someone calculating threat and response with the speed of long necessity. How isolated? Completely, as far as we know. No contact with the 3 factions, no relationship with us until now, nothing. Then they have no early warning capability, and no defensive infrastructure beyond whatever they've built themselves, Kuroka said, already moving in the direction of practical assessment. If the hero faction has redirected meaningful resources there, the timeline for an actual incursion attempt could be considerably shorter than what we had here, because there's no existing ward lattice to compromise gradually. They may simply attack directly. That's what I was afraid of. Issei held her gaze. I want to go. Today, if possible. And I want you with me, because you know what to look for faster than anyone. Kuroka was quiet for a moment, and Issei recognized, in the particular stillness of it, something settling into place that had been uncertain before, some final confirmation of a decision that had been building for weeks without either of them naming it directly. Yes, she said. I'll come. They departed within the hour, Issei moving across the territory and beyond it with the particular speed that the ley line bond granted him, faster than ordinary travel but not without limit, the connection thinning the further he moved from Kyoto's anchored lattice. Kuroka kept pace beside him with the fluid economy of motion that he had come to associate with her, the 2 of them moving westward across mountain ridges and through valleys still deep in winter snow, the landscape changing gradually from the familiar territory around Kyoto into wilder, less tended country. They reached the settlement by early afternoon, a collection of modest dwellings nestled in a river valley, smoke rising from chimneys and thin gray threads against the white winter sky, the particular quiet of a place that had survived, for a very long time, by being too small and too remote to attract attention. The settlement's elder, an aging Tanuki named Hachiru, met them with the deep, immediate suspicion of someone who had spent his entire life avoiding exactly this kind of contact, and it took the better part of an hour of careful, patient explanation, Issei's straightforward honesty doing the work that diplomatic finesse alone might not have accomplished, before Hachiru's wariness gave way to something more like cautious consideration. You're telling me, Hachiru said, that the great organization that hunts our kind for sport has decided we are worth their attention, and that you, a dragon nobody in this valley has ever heard of, have traveled here uninvited to warn us about it. That's pretty much it, yeah, Issei said. I know how it sounds. I'd be suspicious too, honestly, if some stranger showed up at my door with a story like this. But Kuroka here has seen this exact pattern twice before, in other places, and both times the warning came too late to matter. We're trying to make sure that doesn't happen a third time. Hachiru's gaze moved to Kuroka, who met it with the flat, unflinching directness that Issei had come to recognize as her version of credibility, the particular honesty of someone who had earned her caution the hard way and had nothing left to perform. Tohoku, Kuroka said simply. 18 months ago. A community of Oni, similar size to yours, similar isolation. They did not survive the incursion that followed, warning signs almost identical to what you're likely already seeing, if you know where to look. Strange travelers passing through who don't quite fit. Equipment left near old shrine markers or boundary stones that wasn't there before. Animals behaving oddly near the valley's edges, the kind of disturbance that doesn't have an obvious natural cause. Something shifted in Hachiru's expression, A flicker of recognition that told Issei, immediately, that at least one of those signs had already been observed. There was, Hachira said slowly, a stone marker on the eastern ridge. An old boundary stone, from before my grandfather's time. 3 weeks ago, one of the younger Kappa noticed it had been disturbed. Moved slightly, and there was a strange residue on it that nobody could identify. We assumed it was simply weathering. Can you take us there? Kuroka asked immediately. The eastern ridge marker, when they reached it an hour later, told its own story clearly enough to Kuroka's trained perception, a construct embedded in the stone with the same surgical precision as the ones they had found at Kyoto's anchor points, though this one was further along, weeks more developed, the disruption already measurably weakening whatever natural spiritual boundary the marker had once maintained. This needs to come out now, Kuroka said, already beginning the careful, methodical work of unwinding it, and we need to check every other marker stone around this valley's perimeter immediately, because if there's one, there are likely more. It took the rest of the day and well into the evening, Issei and Kuroka working in coordination with several of the settlement's own Senjutsu-capable residents, who watched the process with the particular intensity of people learning, for the first time, a skill that might mean the difference between survival and the alternative. By the time they finished, they had found and removed constructs at 3 of the valley's 5 boundary markers, and Issei had spent considerable time explaining, patiently and repeatedly, the basic principles of how a ley line-based ward might be constructed around the valley using the natural spiritual currents that already ran through it, a project that would take weeks to develop properly but that could begin immediately. I can't build this for you, he told Hachiru, as the evening settled cold and clear over the valley, not properly, not in a way that would actually hold long-term, because this isn't my territory and the bond doesn't work that way. But I can show your people how to start, and I can connect you to people who can help you finish it properly. The Yokai faction in Kyoto, the 3 factions shared intelligence network, all of it. You don't have to do this alone anymore. That's actually the whole point of why I came. Hachira looked at him for a long moment, the wariness of the morning largely gone now, replaced by something that carried the weight of a very old man recalculating, late in his life, assumptions that had governed his entire existence. Why, he said finally, would a dragon, with no obligation to us, no prior relationship, travel this far on a single day's notice to stand in our valley clearing holy light constructs out of our boundary stones? Issei thought about the answer for a moment, because it deserved a real one rather than a quick one. Because 4 months ago, I was the one nobody warned, he said. I was the one whose territory got tested before anyone realized it was happening, and the only reason it worked out was that I had help arrive in time, almost by accident. I don't want anyone else to have to depend on accident the way I did. So when we found out what might be happening here, going was never really a question. It was just when and how fast. Hachiro was quiet for a long moment, and then he bowed, deep and formal, the gesture carrying a weight that Issei understood immediately was significant, was the kind of thing that was not given lightly by someone who had spent a lifetime guarding against exactly this sort of vulnerability. Then this valley, Hachiro said, straightening, extends its gratitude to Kyoto's guardian, and asks, formally, for whatever alliance you are willing to offer. They stayed 3 more days, working alongside the settlement's Senjutsu practitioners to establish the beginnings of a proper boundary structure, Kuroka teaching the construct identification technique to anyone willing to learn it, Issei demonstrating the basic principles of leyline channeling to a small group of interested residents who, while lacking his particular bond, had enough natural spiritual sensitivity to begin developing real capability with patient instruction. By the time they departed, the valley's boundary was incomplete but functional, a genuine early warning system where none had existed before, and Hachiro had agreed, formally, to the same kind of shared intelligence arrangement that Kyoto maintained with the 3 factions, a small but real expansion of the network that Shinra had envisioned months earlier in the archive. This is what it's supposed to look like, Issei said, as they made their way back toward Kyoto through the deepening winter evening, the valley receding behind them, smoke still rising thin and gray from its chimneys, but now, beneath that ordinary domestic peace, the quiet hum of a boundary beginning to wake. Not just us getting strong enough to defend ourselves. Making sure nobody else has to go through what we went through, alone, without anyone showing up in time. Kuroka walked beside him in silence for a while, her expression turned inward in the particular way that meant she was processing something that mattered to her more than her usual composure allowed her to show directly. You know, she said finally, I spent 2 years thinking about communities like that one as something to avoid. Places where someone might recognize me, might know my history, might create complications I didn't have the resources to manage. I never thought about them as places I might actually be able to help. She glanced at him. It is a strange thing, to realize that the running stops not because you finally find somewhere safe enough, but because you find people worth staying for, and the staying itself starts to feel like the safety. Issei looked at her, at the particular openness of the admission, rare and considered, and felt something warm settle in his chest that had nothing to do with the leylines and everything to do with the woman walking beside him through the cold. Yeah, he said softly. That's exactly it. They walked the rest of the way in a silence that had stopped needing to be filled, the mountains dark around them, the stars emerging clear and bright overhead, and somewhere ahead, the lights of Kyoto's shrine glowed warm against the winter night, waiting, as it always seemed to be now, for the people who belonged there to come home. Chapter 16. Spring came to the mountains slowly, the way it always did at altitude, the snow retreating first from the southern slopes and the lower valleys while the higher peaks held on to winter for weeks longer, a gradual negotiation between seasons that Issei found himself watching with the particular attentiveness of someone who had, for the first time in his life, lived somewhere long enough to notice an entire season's turning. The Chugoku Valley had become, over the following months, the first of what Shinra began calling, with the dry satisfaction of a man watching a long-held theory finally bear fruit, the network. Word of what had happened there, the warning given in time, the boundary established before catastrophe rather than after, traveled through the same channels that had once carried only rumors of isolated communities being slowly, quietly erased. By early spring, 3 more settlements, 2 more communities of yokai scattered across the Chugoku and Shikoku regions and 1 small group of unaffiliated supernatural beings living in the mountains north of Hiroshima, had reached out through various intermediaries, asking, in tones ranging from cautious to openly hopeful, whether the kind of alliance Kyoto had extended to Hachiro's Valley might be available to them as well. We cannot personally visit each of them the way you visited Chugoku, Shinra told Issei, during one of their now regular strategy sessions, the spring sun warm enough to leave the study's paper screens open for the first time in months. Not at the pace this is developing. If word continues to spread at its current rate, we will have a dozen requests by midsummer, and you cannot be in a dozen places. So what do we do instead? We build infrastructure that does not require your personal presence for every individual case. Shinra unrolled a new map across the table, one Issei hadn't seen before, the existing yokai territory marked in its familiar boundaries but now surrounded by a constellation of smaller marks, dots representing the communities that had reached out, lines tentatively sketched between them and Kyoto. I propose we establish what I am calling, for lack of a better term, traveling instruction teams. Senior practitioners from our own territory, trained in the construct identification techniques Kuroka has taught us, along with basic ley line channeling principles adapted from your own bond, sent out to assess and assist communities that request it. You remain available for the most severe or time-sensitive cases, the way you were for Chugoku. But the broader work of spreading this protection does not need to rest solely on your shoulders. Issei studied the map, the slowly expanding constellation of marks, and felt something settle into place that had been, until this moment, somewhat unformed in his mind, the recognition that what had begun as his own desperate, improvised survival was becoming something far larger and more deliberate, an actual structure, a genuine institution, the kind of thing that could outlast any single person's involvement in it. This is good, he said. This is really good, Shinra. Who would lead the teams? I would suggest Kuroka lead the training program itself, given her unique expertise. As for who staffs the teams once trained, I believe several of our younger practitioners have shown real aptitude, and the work itself, I suspect, will attract more volunteers as its value becomes apparent. Shinra paused, his expression carrying a particular quality of consideration. There is also the question of Kuno. Issei looked up. Kuno? She's 11. She is 11, and she has been training with Kuroka for months, and her natural aptitude with fox fire technique has developed considerably faster than is typical even for her lineage. Shinra's tone was careful, the tone he used when he was raising something delicate. I am not suggesting she be sent into the field, Issei. I am simply noting that Lady Yasaka's daughter is growing into someone with real capability, and that the question of her role in all of this, not now, but eventually, is one that I believe the three of you, Lady Yasaka, and Kuoh herself, will need to consider as the years progress. Issei thought about this, about Kuoh, who had grown from the curious child who'd watched him sleep on his first morning in Kyoto into someone whose fox fire technique had genuinely impressed even Kuroka's exacting standards, who asked increasingly sophisticated questions about strategy and diplomacy during their evening conversations, who was, Issei realized with the particular vertigo of recognizing a slow change all at once, no longer quite the small child she had been when he arrived. Yeah, he said. Yeah, we should talk about that. Not pushing her into anything. Just paying attention to what she wants, and making sure she has the support to grow into whatever that turns out to be. That, Shinra said, is precisely the approach I would have recommended. That evening, Issei found Kuoh in the training yard alone, practicing a sequence of movements with focused, private intensity, her small frame moving with a precision that had clearly been built through hundreds of repetitions, fox fire flickering at her fingertips in controlled, deliberate bursts rather than the wild, enthusiastic flares of her earlier attempts. You've gotten really good, he said, settling onto the low wall at the yard's edge to watch. Kuoh startled slightly, then composed herself with the dignity of someone who had been caught at something private but was not embarrassed by it. Kuroka says I have good instincts. She says most people my age would still be struggling with basic ignition, but I can already do directional control. There was pride in her voice, carefully restrained but present. That's incredible, Kuoh. Seriously. Issei meant it, watching her demonstrate a tight, controlled arc of blue-white fire that curved precisely around an imaginary obstacle before dissipating. Can I ask you something? Sure. What do you want to do with it? The fox fire, the training. Not right now, but eventually. Have you thought about that? Kuoh was quiet for a moment, her tails swishing thoughtfully behind her, and when she answered, there was a seriousness in her voice that Issei hadn't quite heard from her before, the particular gravity of someone articulating something they had been thinking about privately for some time. I want to help protect this place, she said. Like you do. Like Mother does. I used to just want to be strong because being strong seemed cool, but after the hero faction attacked, after I saw how scared everyone was, even though it worked out, I started thinking about it differently. I don't want to just watch other people protect everyone. I want to actually be able to help. When I'm older. She looked at him directly, the directness so reminiscent of Yasaka that it caught at something in his chest. Do you think I could? Actually help, I mean. Not just train for fun. I think, Issei said carefully, because the question deserved real consideration rather than easy reassurance, that you already are helping, just by learning, by getting stronger, by caring this much about it. And I think that by the time you're old enough for it to really matter, you're going to be someone this territory is lucky to have. Not because anyone's going to push you into it. Because you actually want it, and because you're already showing the kind of instincts that matter more than raw power, the same kind your mother has. Kuoh's expression brightened with a pleasure that she tried unsuccessfully to contain within a more composed exterior. Kuroka says something similar? That the instincts matter more than the raw power, especially at the start. She paused. Are you going to talk to Mother about this? About me wanting to actually train for real, not just, playing? If you want me to. Or you could talk to her yourself. I think she'd really want to hear it from you. Kuoh considered this, then nodded slowly. I'll talk to her. But... A small pause, slightly shy in a way that was unusual for her. Maybe you could be there too. When I do. I think it would be easier. I'd be honored, Issei said, and meant it completely, the particular weight of being asked to be present for something that mattered to her settling warm and significant in his chest. The conversation with Yasaka happened 3 days later, in the study, the spring evening warm enough now that they sat with the screens open to the garden, the koi pond visible beyond, the first cherry blossoms of the season just beginning to open on the trees that lined its edge. Kuoh sat between Issei and Yasaka, her posture carefully composed, the particular seriousness of someone who has rehearsed something important and is determined to deliver it properly. She spoke for nearly 10 minutes, laying out, with a clarity that surprised even Issei, who had already heard the substance of it, exactly what she wanted, why she wanted it, what she had already accomplished in her training, and what she hoped to accomplish going forward. Yasaka listened with the complete, undivided attention she gave to everything that mattered to her, and when Kuoh finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. "You have clearly thought about this carefully," Yasaka said finally, her voice warm but measured. "And I am proud of you, Kuoh, for the seriousness with which you have approached it. I have one question, and I want you to answer it honestly, not because you think it is the answer I want to hear. Okay. Are you doing this because you genuinely want it for yourself, or because you feel some obligation, given everything that has happened here, to become someone who can fight?" Kuoh considered this with visible care, the question clearly landing with the weight it deserved. "I think," she said slowly, "it started as wanting to be strong because strong seemed important, after everything that happened. But it's not that anymore. I like the training. I like getting better at it. I like the feeling when I finally get a technique right after failing at it a bunch of times. I think I'd want to do this even if nothing dangerous was happening at all. The protecting people part it's important to me, but it's not the only reason anymore." Yasaka's expression, listening to this, carried a depth of warmth that Issei recognized as profound relief layered beneath profound pride, the particular combination of a parent who has asked a difficult question and received, in response, exactly the kind of honest answer that confirms their child is growing into herself rather than into someone else's expectations. "Then you have my full support," Yasaka said. "Continue your training with Kuroka. As you grow, we will discuss, gradually and carefully, what increased responsibility might look like, always at a pace that respects both your safety and your own readiness. I will not push you faster than you are ready to go, Kuoh, no matter how talented you prove to be. But I am deeply glad, and deeply proud, that this is something you have chosen for yourself, with such clear thought." Kuno's composure finally broke, the careful seriousness giving way to a bright, unguarded smile, and she threw her arms around her mother's neck with the particular fierce affection that had not changed at all despite how much else about her had grown and developed over the past months. Issei watched them, the warmth of the room and the cherry blossoms beyond the open screens and the koi moving slow and patient beneath the pond's surface, and felt, distinctly, the particular fullness of being present for something that mattered, of being trusted enough to be asked to witness it. "You did really well," he told Kuoh later, as they walked together back toward the main hall, the spring evening soft and fragrant around them. "Both the conversation, and the training that got you to that conversation. I'm really proud of you too, you know. Not just your mom." Kuoh glanced up at him, and something in her expression, briefly vulnerable in a way she rarely allowed herself to be, made him stop walking and turn to face her properly. "Issei," she said, "can I ask you something? It might be a weird question." "Sure. Ask away. Do you think of me as, like?" She paused, working through the phrasing with visible care. "Not as your kid exactly, because you're not really my dad. But like family. Real family. Not just mother's daughter that you're nice to because of mother." Issei felt the question land with its full weight, recognizing in it something Kuoh had clearly been working up the courage to ask for some time, and he answered it the way he had learned, over the past months, that the most important answers deserved to be answered, with complete honesty and without hesitation. "Yeah," he said. "I really do." "Your family, Kuoh? Real family, not the kind that comes with an asterisk. I don't know exactly what the word for what I am to you should be. Dad doesn't feel quite right and I don't think it needs to, but family, that part's not complicated at all. That part I'm completely sure about." Kuno's eyes were bright, and for a moment she didn't say anything, just looked at him with an expression that contained more feeling than her usual composed exuberance typically allowed to surface. Then she stepped forward and hugged him, quick and fierce, the way she had hugged her mother moments before, and Issei held on, the warmth of the evening and the fragrance of cherry blossoms and the steady, patient hum of the ley lines beneath them all combining into something that felt, simply and completely, like home. Good, Kuoh said into his shoulder, her voice slightly muffled but entirely clear in its certainty. That's good. I'm glad. They walked the rest of the way together in comfortable silence, and behind them, the cherry blossoms continued their slow unfolding into the spring evening, marking, in their own quiet and ancient way, the steady, accumulating passage of a life that had become, against every reasonable expectation Issei had carried with him up that mountain 7 months before, genuinely and completely his own. Chapter 17. Azazel's visit, when it finally happened in earnest rather than as a brief diplomatic appearance, lasted considerably longer than anyone at the shrine had anticipated, and it began, as most things involving the fallen angel Governor-General apparently did, with significantly more enthusiasm than formal notice. He arrived on a clear morning in late spring with a small research team and an array of equipment that Issei did not recognize but that Shinra, after a brief examination, identified with visible interest as instrumentation designed for measuring spiritual energy resonance. The kind of specialized devices that the Fallen Angels Research Division had apparently spent considerable resources developing over the preceding decades. I did say I wanted to run tests, Azazel said by way of explanation, setting up a piece of equipment that looked, to Issei's eye, like a cross between a tea ceremony set and something out of a science fiction film. I trust this isn't an imposition. I cleared it with Lady Yasaka's office 2 weeks ago. It's fine, Issei said, eyeing the equipment with a mixture of curiosity and mild wariness. Though I should say up front, I don't really understand most of what you're about to do. That's all right, either do most of my own research staff, half the time. Science is mostly about doing things and writing down what happens. Azazel's grin was quick and genuinely delighted, the expression of someone who had been anticipating this particular morning for some time. Now, hold still, and tell me if anything feels unusual. The tests, over the following days, ranged from the straightforward, measuring the resonance frequency of Issei's draconic energy against various baseline samples, to the considerably stranger. An extended session in which Azazel had Issei attempt to channel different ratios of leyline energy to draconic power, while a small array of crystalline devices recorded data that meant nothing to Issei but appeared to mean a great deal to the research team, who reacted to certain results with the kind of hushed, excited muttering that suggested genuine scientific significance. This is remarkable, Azazel said on the third day, reviewing a set of results with the focused intensity of someone who had found something that justified an entire career's worth of theoretical speculation. The resonance pattern you're producing, it's not simply two energies coexisting in the same vessel. They're actually harmonizing at a fundamental level, creating a third frequency that doesn't match either source individually. Do you understand what that means? Not even a little bit, Issei admitted. It means you're not merely a dragon who happens to also have leyline access. You're something genuinely new, a synthesis that didn't exist before this specific combination of circumstances occurred. The implications for sacred gear research alone are. Azazel paused, visibly working to contain his enthusiasm within something resembling professional restraint. I would very much like to study this further, with your permission, over an extended period. Not invasively. Simply, ongoing observation, periodic measurement, the kind of longitudinal study that might tell us something genuinely important about the relationship between draconic power and natural spiritual energy. I'm fine with that, Issei said, as long as it doesn't interfere with my actual responsibilities here. Tending the territory comes first. Of course. I'm not trying to turn you into a laboratory specimen, just. Azazel's expression turned briefly, more serious than his usual energetic enthusiasm typically allowed. Issei, I want to say something, and I want you to take it seriously, because I don't say this kind of thing often. What you've built here, in less than a year, it's not just personally impressive. It's structurally important. The supernatural world has operated, for centuries, on a model where power concentrates in a handful of major factions and everyone else either aligns with one of them or remains vulnerable to exactly the kind of campaign the hero faction has been running. What you're demonstrating, a genuinely independent power center that builds alliance networks based on mutual benefit rather than subordination, that's new. That could actually change how the rest of the world thinks about regional security. I have a vested interest in that change happening, which is part of why I keep showing up here with too much equipment and too many questions. Issei absorbed this, the particular weight of being told that something he had built somewhat instinctively, out of necessity and care rather than grand strategic vision, carried implications this significant. I wasn't trying to change how the whole world works, he said. I was just trying to protect the people who'd taken me in. I know. That's rather the point, isn't it? The best changes usually start that way. Azazel's grin returned, lighter now. Anyway. More tests tomorrow, if you're willing. And I'd like to talk to your Nikomata friend again, if she's amenable. Her knowledge of hero faction construct technology is more extensive than anything in my own intelligence files, and I suspect there's value in formalizing that knowledge into something more broadly shareable. Kuroka, when approached about this, regarded the prospect with her usual careful consideration before agreeing, on the condition that the resulting documentation be made available freely to any genuinely allied community rather than treated as proprietary intelligence, a condition Azazel accepted with the immediate, unhesitating agreement of someone who had clearly expected and respected the stipulation. The collaboration that followed, over the subsequent weeks, produced what eventually became known, somewhat to Kuroka's visible discomfort with the formality of the title, as the Yazen Protocol, a standardized methodology for identifying and neutralizing the specific class of anti-Senjutsu constructs the hero faction had been using. Distributed through the three factions' shared intelligence network and made available to any community that requested it through the growing web of alliances Kyoto had begun cultivating. They named it after me, Kuroka said, with the particular flat bemusement of someone who was not entirely certain how she felt about that fact. During a quiet evening at the koi pond several weeks later, the spring air warm and fragrant with blooming jasmine. You earned it, Issei said. You're the reason any of us know what to look for in the first place. I spent 2 years running from people who would have called what I know dangerous knowledge, if they'd known I had it. Now it has my name attached to it and gets distributed across multiple supernatural factions as a defensive resource. Kuroka shook her head slowly, though the gesture carried more wonder than complaint. It's a strange thing, to have something that was once a liability become, instead, the thing you're most known for contributing. Welcome to the club, Issei said, with a small, knowing smile. I spent 2 years being the guy everyone benched because my ideas weren't worth listening to. Now apparently I'm some kind of structurally important new model for regional supernatural security, according to Azazel, who I'm pretty sure overstates things sometimes but also isn't wrong very often. Kuroka laughed, an actual, unguarded laugh, rare enough still that Issei treasured each instance of it, and the sound carried clear and warm across the quiet evening water. We make quite a pair, she said. The discarded strategist and the runaway with dangerous knowledge, both ending up being exactly what this place needed most. I think that's kind of the whole point of this place, Issei said. Yasaka built it on the idea that what gets dismissed elsewhere might actually be exactly what's needed, if you give it the right context to grow into. He looked at her, the spring evening light catching the silver of her hair, the two black tails resting easily against the wooden walkway rather than the tense, defensive coil they had held the first night he'd found her in the snow. You've changed a lot, you know. Since winter. So have you, Kuroka said, meeting his gaze directly, though I think you were further along that particular path before I arrived. A pause, and something in her expression shifted, careful and considering, the particular quality that preceded her rare moments of significant honesty. Issei. I want to say something, and I'd like you to let me finish before responding, because I've been thinking about how to say it for some time and I don't want to lose my courage halfway through. Okay, Issei said, giving her his full attention. I came here originally because I was curious, and because I was injured, and because some part of me, even then, recognized that this place might be different from everywhere else I'd run to and found, eventually, that it wasn't. I stayed, at first, because of the practical arrangement, the early warning system, the genuine usefulness of what I could offer. But somewhere over these past months, the reasons changed, and I find that I am no longer staying because it is useful. I am staying because... She paused, and Issei watched her gather the particular courage that honesty about feeling, rather than honesty about fact, seemed to require of her. Because I have come to care for this place, and for the people in it, more than I expected to be capable of caring for anything again. Including you, Issei? Particularly you. The words settled into the quiet evening with a weight that Issei felt fully, the careful, hard-won honesty of someone for whom this kind of vulnerability did not come easily or often. I care about you too, he said, simply and directly, because the moment didn't call for elaboration, only truth. I have for a while, honestly. I wasn't sure how to bring it up, partly because of everything you'd been through, and I didn't want you to feel pressured into something just because of, I don't know, proximity or gratitude or whatever. I wanted you to get there on your own time, if you got there at all. I appreciate that. More than I think I've properly told you. Kuroka's expression was open now, in the particular unguarded way that had become more frequent but never less significant. I should also say, since we are apparently being thoroughly honest this evening, that I am aware of your relationship with Yasaka, and I have thought carefully about what it would mean to feel this way while that relationship exists, and continues to matter deeply to both of you. And I do not believe it troubles me the way it perhaps should, by conventional standards. Kuroka's tone carried the careful precision she used when articulating something she had considered at length. Yasaka has never treated me as competition, or as a complication to manage. She has treated me, since the first week, as someone whose well-being she genuinely cares about, independent of my relationship to you. I think, if I am honest, that the warmth I feel toward this place is inseparable from the warmth she has shown me from the very beginning. I do not know exactly what this means for the shape of things going forward. But I do not feel that it requires choosing between you, or replacing what already exists. I feel, instead, that there may be room for something that includes all three of us, in whatever form that takes, without anyone needing to be diminished by it. Issei sat with this, the particular vertigo of recognizing that a conversation he had been quietly anxious about for weeks was resolving itself with far more grace and clarity than he had dared hope for. I'd like that, he said. If you're sure. I don't want you to feel like you have to fit into something that already exists, like there's a shape you need to squeeze into. I am not squeezing into anything, Kuroka said, with the flat certainty that characterized her most genuine statements. I am choosing, deliberately and with full awareness of what I am choosing, to build something alongside the two of you, in whatever shape it naturally takes. That is different from fitting into a predetermined mold, Issei. I have spent enough of my life being told what shape I was supposed to take. I do not intend to repeat that mistake here, in the one place that has finally given me the freedom not to. Issei reached over and took her hand, the gesture careful and deliberate, an offering rather than an assumption, and Kuroka's fingers closed around his with a firmness that answered the question more clearly than words might have. Then let's see what shape it takes, he said softly, echoing, without quite realizing it, the words Yasaka had spoken to him months before by this same pond, on a winter evening that felt, now, like the distant beginning of everything that had followed. They sat together in the gathering dusk, the coin moving slow and golden beneath the water, the jasmine perfuming the warm spring air, and somewhere within the shrine behind them, a light moved across a paper screen as Yasaka, finishing her own evening work, glanced out toward the pond and saw the two figures sitting together in the fading light, hands joined, and felt, watching them, not jealousy or concern but something warmer and more complicated, a quiet, growing certainty that whatever was forming between the three of them was something rare and worth tending with exactly the same patient care she had given everything else that mattered to her across her very long life. She did not interrupt them. She simply watched, for a moment, with a small, private smile, and then returned to her work, content in the knowledge that there would be time, later, for all three of them to talk properly about what came next. There was, after all, a great deal of time. Centuries of it, if the old records held true. And Yasaka, who had learned more than almost anyone alive about the particular value of patience applied to things worth having, found that the prospect did not frighten her in the slightest. It felt, instead, like exactly the kind of gift she had stopped expecting her long life might still hold in store for her, arriving, as the best gifts often did, when she had finally stopped looking too hard for it. Chapter 18. The three of them talked properly, As Yasaka had anticipated, on a warm evening some days later, the conversation unfolding with the same unhurried honesty that had characterized everything significant in Issei's new life. There was no dramatic confrontation, no painful negotiation of jealousy or competing claims, because none of the three people involved approached the conversation looking for those things. What emerged instead was something Issei found himself thinking of, in the days that followed, as architecture rather than romance exactly, though the warmth and affection were unmistakably real, a careful, deliberate building of a structure that could hold all three of them without anyone's needs being treated as secondary to anyone else's. I want to be clear about something, Yasaka said, partway through that first real conversation, her hand resting easily in Issei's while Kuroka sat across from them with the careful, attentive stillness she brought to anything that mattered deeply. I do not expect either of you to love me, or each other, in identical ways, or in proportions that mirror some predetermined formula. What I hope for, what I think we can build, is something honest, where what exists between Issei and myself remains real and is not diminished by what grows between Issei and Kuroka, and where, in time, perhaps something grows between the two of us as well, organically, without pressure, simply because we have found that we are building a life together and life together tends to produce its own forms of closeness. That seems fair, Kuroka said, with the particular care she brought to agreements she intended to honor completely. I would add only that I do not want to be treated with caution, as though my presence requires constant management or reassurance. I have spent enough of my life being handled carefully by people who were uncertain about me. I would prefer, if this is to work, that we simply proceed honestly, and trust that honesty resolves most difficulties before they become difficulties at all. I can do that, Issei said, and found, examining the statement, that it was entirely true, that the particular quality of patience and presence the leyline bond had given him made this kind of honest, unhurried navigation feel natural rather than effortful. I think the thing I want most, out of all of this, is for both of you to feel like what you have is real and yours, not borrowed from each other or diminished by the other person existing. I don't think loving more than one person means loving either of you less. I think it just means there's more room in my life for the people who matter, and I'd rather that room exist generously than be rationed carefully. The months that followed bore out the wisdom of that approach. Kuroka moved, gradually, from her guest quarters in the east wing to rooms nearer Issei's own, the transition handled with the same unhurried practicality that characterized everything about her once she had decided something mattered. Kuno, predictably delighted by the development once it was explained to her in terms she could process, declared herself thoroughly in favor of having two parental figures who weren't her actual mother, on the grounds that it meant more people available to watch her practice her foxfire technique and more people willing to argue with her about bedtime, a logic that both Issei and Kuroka found, despite themselves, difficult to refute. Summer arrived in earnest, the mountains around Kyoto deepening into full green, the boundary wards humming with the particular vitality that the warmest months always brought, and the network Shinra had begun building continued its steady, careful expansion. By midsummer, 6 communities beyond the original Chugoku Valley had joined the alliance, each one approached with the same patient, honest care that had characterized the original outreach, each one strengthened not merely by Kyoto's direct intervention but by the growing pool of trained practitioners capable of identifying and neutralizing hero faction infiltration techniques. It was during this period of expansion that the most significant test of the network's actual capability arrived, not from the hero faction directly, but from an unexpected quarter that nonetheless connected, in ways that became clear only gradually, to the same broader pattern. A messenger arrived at the shrine in midsummer carrying urgent word from one of the more recently allied communities, a small group of kitsune living in the mountains near Okayama who had joined the network only 2 months earlier. Their settlement had come under sudden, violent attack, not from the hero faction, but from a faction of rogue exorcists, independent operators who had broken from official church sanction years earlier and operated now as something closer to mercenaries, selling their services and their holy light expertise to whoever could afford them. The timing is significant, Shinra said, reading the messenger's report with the particular intensity that meant he was already working through implications. Rogue exorcists, operating independently, attacking a community that joined our alliance network only recently, and that has not yet developed significant defensive infrastructure. This could be coincidence. It could also be that someone, having observed the pattern of communities strengthening once they affiliate with Kyoto, has identified the window between alliance and actual defensive capability as the moment of maximum vulnerability, and is exploiting it specifically. You think someone's targeting the newer alliance members deliberately, Issei said, the cold, familiar weight of strategic concern settling into him. Hitting them before we can actually help them build up defenses. It is a possibility that I believe warrants immediate, serious attention. And if it is correct, it suggests an adversary considerably more sophisticated than simple hero faction escalation. Someone studying our patterns and adapting accordingly. Shinra's expression was grave. We need to respond, Issei, and we need to respond quickly, both to protect the Okayama community directly and to demonstrate, clearly, that the vulnerability window theory does not actually hold, that Kyoto's alliance network protects its members even before full defensive infrastructure is established. Issei was already moving, the decision made before Shinra finished speaking, the particular clarity of urgent necessity cutting through everything else. I'm going, he said. Now. Kuroka, are you with me? Already moving, Kuroka confirmed, her combat kimono materializing into readiness with the same swift efficiency she'd shown during the winter assault months before. Yasaka caught his arm briefly as he prepared to depart, her expression carrying the particular weight of someone managing real concern through disciplined composure. Be careful, she said. Rogue exorcists operate without the institutional constraints that govern official church operatives. They are unpredictable in ways that organized hero faction units are not. I know. We'll be careful. He held her gaze for a moment, the depth of feeling between them needing no elaborate expression to be understood completely. I'll come back. I always come back. I know you will, Yasaka said softly. Go. They need you faster than I need you to stay and reassure me. The journey to Okayama took most of the day even with the speed the ley line bond afforded him, the connection thinning noticeably the further he traveled from Kyoto's anchored territory, and Issei found himself, for the first time since the bond's formation, genuinely testing its outer limits, the power available to him diminishing the further he moved from the territory's heart, while still remaining, he was relieved to discover, considerably more than what an ordinary Sekyutai would carry. The bond extends further than I expected, partner, Drake observed, as they crossed into unfamiliar mountain terrain well beyond Kyoto's borders. Diminished certainly, but present even this far out. I suspect this range will only grow as the bond deepens further with time. Good to know, Issei said, conserving his breath for the journey, Kuroka keeping pace beside him with her own tireless economy of motion. They reached the Kitsune settlement as evening was falling, smoke rising not from ordinary chimneys but from at least 2 buildings actively burning, the sounds of conflict audible from a considerable distance, holy light flashing intermittently against the darkening sky like distant lightning. Issei did not slow down. He arrived in the settlement's central square at a dead run, the boosted gear already blazing on his arm, and took in the scene with the rapid, comprehensive assessment that months of practice had built into him. A dozen kitsune, mostly elderly or very young, sheltering in the lee of the largest remaining building. 6 rogue exorcists, their robes marked with the particular insignia that distinguished them from official church operatives, working through the settlement with the brutal efficiency of professionals who had clearly done this kind of work before. And at the center of the conflict, 3 of the settlement's own defenders, young kitsune who had clearly received some basic training but were badly, dangerously outmatched. Boost, the gauntlet said, and Issei moved. He reached the nearest defender just as a rogue exorcist's holy blade descended toward an opening in her guard, catching the strike on the boosted gear's gauntlet with enough force to send the exorcist staggering backward, and in the same motion, without pause, Issei extended his awareness into the ground beneath them, finding, even this far from Kyoto's anchored territory, enough natural spiritual current in the earth to work with, channeling it into a wide, sweeping pulse that knocked 3 of the remaining exorcists from their feet entirely. Boost, the gauntlet said again, and the power doubled, and Issei moved through the remaining conflict with the same precise, economical force that had become his signature, not destruction for its own sake but exactly enough disruption to end the threat without unnecessary brutality. Kuroka arrived a heartbeat behind him, her senjutsu energy already flaring outward in the particular binding pattern she had perfected over months of practice. Two more exorcists finding themselves abruptly and completely immobilized before they fully registered that reinforcements had arrived. The fight, such as it was, lasted less than 2 minutes from the moment Issei entered the square. The rogue exorcists, professional and pragmatic in the way that mercenaries tended to be, recognized quickly that the calculation had changed dramatically and disastrously against them, and the survivors fled into the gathering darkness rather than continuing an engagement that had become, in the span of moments, catastrophically unfavorable. Issei moved immediately to help extinguish the burning buildings, channeling leyline energy, thinner here but still present, to assist the settlement's own water sources in dousing the flames, while Kuroka worked through the wounded with the same practical, efficient care she had shown in every crisis since arriving in Kyoto the previous winter. By the time full darkness had fallen, the immediate crisis had passed. The fires were out. The wounded, while several were serious, were stable. And the settlement's elder, an elderly fox woman who had clearly aged through more difficult nights than this one in her long life, found Issei in the settlement's central square and bowed to him with a depth and duration that conveyed more than any words could have. "You came," she said, straightening, her voice carrying the particular roughness of someone who had spent the preceding hours genuinely uncertain whether help would arrive at all. "We only sent word this morning." "I did not expect. We came as fast as we could," Issei said. "I'm sorry it wasn't faster. I'm sorry you had to go through this at all." "You came," the elder repeated, as though this fact alone outweighed every other consideration. "That is more than this settlement has ever had, in all the years before your alliance was offered. We will rebuild. And we will continue strengthening, with whatever support your network can offer, because tonight has shown us, more clearly than any agreement on paper could have, what that alliance actually means." They stayed 2 more days, helping with immediate reconstruction and beginning, alongside Kuroka's now well-practiced instruction, the work of establishing proper boundary defenses for the settlement, the same patient, careful process that had characterized every expansion of the network since Chugoku. On the journey back to Kyoto, Issei found himself thinking through the implications of what they'd discovered, the deliberate targeting of newly allied communities during their vulnerable transition period, the sophistication of an adversary, whether directly hero faction or some loosely affiliated network of rogue operators, capable of identifying and exploiting that specific window. "We need to change how we onboard new alliance members," he said to Kuroka, as they made their way back through the summer evening, the mountains around them deepening into the particular blue shadow that preceded full dark. "Faster initial defensive support. Maybe a rapid response capability specifically for communities in that first vulnerable window, before their own infrastructure is established." "I agree," Kuroka said. "And I think we should consider training a dedicated rapid response team, rather than relying solely on you for every urgent case. Tonight worked because we got there in time. We will not always be fast enough, especially as the network continues to grow and the geographic spread increases." "You're right." Issei thought about this, the practical weight of an alliance network that had grown, in less than a year, from a single desperate act on a mountain path into something with genuine institutional complexity, requiring genuine institutional solutions. "We should talk to Yasaka and Shinra about it when we get back. Maybe start training a small group specifically for rapid intervention. People who can move fast, identify threats accurately, and hold a position until reinforcements arrive." "I would be willing to lead that training," Kuroka said, and there was something in her voice, a particular quality of purpose and investment, that told Issei this mattered to her in a way that went beyond simple practical agreement. "I spent 2 years being someone who ran from exactly this kind of violence. I find that I would rather spend the years ahead being someone who runs toward it, on behalf of people who cannot yet defend themselves." Issei looked at her, the summer starlight catching the silver of her hair, the quiet, settled certainty in her expression that had replaced, so gradually he had almost not noticed the transformation happening, the guarded exhaustion of the woman he had found in the snow 8 months before. "You'd be incredible at that," he said. "Honestly, I think you already are. they walked the rest of the way home together, the network behind them stronger for the night's work despite its cost, the territory ahead of them waiting with its familiar warm welcome, and somewhere in the vast, patient architecture of alliances and leylines and chosen family that had grown, almost without Issei fully realizing how much it had grown, from a single act of refusing to walk past someone in trouble, the quiet, steady work of building something worth protecting continued, one decision, one relationship, one rescued settlement at a time. Chapter 19. Autumn returned to Kyoto a full year after Issei had first walked up the mountain path with nothing but a duffel bag and the wreckage of a life he had decided to leave behind, and the shrine marked the occasion, quietly and without much formal ceremony, in a way that nonetheless carried significant weight for everyone who had been present for the year's events. Yasaka had suggested, gently, weeks in advance, that they hold a small gathering, not the formal feast that had followed the leyline ritual itself, but something quieter, a recognition among the people who had built this together of how far the year had carried them. Issei had agreed readily, and the planning, when it began, took on a quality that surprised him, the realization that the guest list for even a quiet gathering had grown considerably beyond what he would have imagined possible a year before. Lord Tendu attended, along with two of his sons who had, over the preceding months, become regular visitors to the shrine as the relationship between their houses deepened into something approaching genuine friendship. Sona arrived with a small delegation that included, somewhat to Issei's surprised pleasure, two members of her own peerage who had developed, through repeated diplomatic visits, real working relationships with several of the shrine's younger practitioners. Azazel appeared with rather less equipment than usual, apparently having decided that this particular visit called for restraint, though he brought with him a detailed written summary of the past year's research findings as a gift, which Issei suspected was, for Azazel, the equivalent of a deeply personal gesture. Hachira traveled from the Chugoku Valley with two of his community's senior practitioners, the journey itself a testament to how thoroughly that alliance had developed, the valley's own defensive infrastructure now robust enough that its elder leader felt secure leaving for several days to attend a celebration in distant Kyoto. The Kitsune elder from Okayama sent her regrets at being unable to travel but included, with the message, a carefully wrapped gift of preserved persimmons that her settlement had become known for, along with a note expressing gratitude that required no further elaboration. Even Venelana Gremory sent a formal but warm message, along with a small token gift, acknowledging the anniversary and expressing, in the careful diplomatic language she favored, continued appreciation for the stability the alliance with Kyoto had brought to the region. The gathering itself unfolded across a long autumn afternoon in the shrine's main courtyard, the maple trees overhead just beginning their seasonal turn toward red and gold, the air carrying the particular crisp clarity that autumn brought to the mountains. Issei moved through the gathering with the easy warmth that had become natural to him, the same gift for genuine connection that Yasaka had identified, all the way back in those early weeks, as one of his most valuable qualities, and found himself, at various points throughout the afternoon, simply standing still and absorbing the scope of what surrounded him. A year ago, he had been alone, exhausted, walking up a mountain path with no plan beyond putting distance between himself and a life that had made clear it did not value what he actually was. Now he stood in a courtyard full of people, devils and fallen angels and yokai of half a dozen different kinds, all of them present not out of obligation or formal diplomatic necessity but because something real connected them to this place and to the people who had built it. He found Kuno partway through the afternoon, demonstrating an increasingly sophisticated foxfire technique to an audience of delighted younger guests, her confidence and skill both visibly matured from the eager, untrained child of a year before into someone whose competence was becoming genuinely formidable, while still retaining all the warmth and enthusiasm that made her so entirely herself. He found Kuroka in quieter conversation with two of Sona's peerage members, discussing, with the easy professional confidence that had replaced her early wariness entirely, the technical details of construct identification techniques that had, over the past year, saved more lives than anyone could easily count. He found Shinra holding court with several of the elder practitioners from allied communities, the particular satisfaction of a man watching a long-held vision finally take concrete shape evident in every line of his posture. And he found Yasaka, near the koi pond, watching the gathering with an expression that combined deep contentment with something more complicated, something Issei recognized, when he settled beside her, as the particular weight of someone measuring the present against the past that had, for a very long time, offered considerably less reason for hope. "It's a lot, isn't it?" he said, settling beside her, taking in the courtyard full of warmth and connection and chosen family. "More than either of us probably expected, that first night." "Considerably more," Yasaka agreed softly. "Issei, I want to tell you something, and I have been waiting for the right moment to say it properly, rather than simply in passing." She turned to face him fully, her expression carrying a depth of feeling that made him give her his complete attention. "When you arrived on that mountain a year ago, I believed, truly, that I was offering you something significant. A purpose, a home, a connection to something ancient and worth protecting. I did not fully understand, at the time, how much more you would give in return. Not merely power, though the power has mattered enormously, but the particular quality of hope you carried with you, the stubborn, persistent belief that things could be better than they currently were, that isolation could become connection, that a faction written off by history as too small and too vulnerable to matter could become, instead, the center of something genuinely new and good in this world. I do not think I fully appreciated, that first night, what an extraordinary gift I was being given, alongside whatever I offered you in return." Issei felt the weight of this settle into him, the particular emotion of being seen, fully and completely, for everything he had tried to be over the past year, not just the power or the diplomatic success but the underlying hope that had driven all of it. "I think we gave each other something we both needed," he said. "I needed somewhere to actually matter, to be valued for everything I was instead of just the parts that were convenient. You needed someone who could help carry what you'd been carrying alone for so long. I don't think either of us could have built what's happening in this courtyard without the other." "No," Yasaka agreed. "I do not think we could have." They sat together for a while, watching the gathering, the autumn light deepening toward gold as the afternoon wore on, and eventually Kuroka joined them, settling on Issei's other side with the easy familiarity that had developed between the three of them over the preceding months, and for a while the three of them simply sat together in comfortable silence, watching the courtyard full of people who had, in one way or another, found something worth protecting and worth building in the alliance. Kyoto had extended to them. "Shinra tells me," Kuroka said eventually, "that 3 more communities have reached out this week alone, asking about the alliance network. The Okayama incident and the Chugoku precedent together seem to have established, fairly definitively, what this actually offers." "It's growing faster than any of us expected," Issei said. "It is growing," Yasaka said, "at exactly the pace that careful, sustainable growth should occur. Quickly enough to matter, slowly enough that we do not overextend the resources required to support each new alliance properly. I think, if I am honest, that this is precisely the pace I would have chosen, if I had been planning this deliberately from the start, rather than discovering it through the simple necessity of responding to what each new day required of us." "Shinra's already talking about needing a formal council," Issei said. "Like, an actual governance structure for the alliance network, beyond just Kyoto making case-by-case decisions about how to help each new community. Representatives from the bigger allied settlements, regular meetings, that kind of thing." "I think that is wise," Yasaka said. "What we have built," Issei, "has outgrown the scale at which a single person, or even a single small group, can manage it through individual judgment alone, however good that judgment might be. It requires structure now. Institutions. The kind of durable framework that will outlast any of our individual involvement, and continue serving the people who depend on it regardless of who specifically is making the decisions at any given moment." Issei thought about this, about the particular satisfaction of building something that had grown beyond the need for his constant personal intervention, something that could continue and strengthen even in moments when he wasn't the one actively driving it forward. "I like that," he said. "That it's not just about me being strong enough to handle everything personally. That it's actually become something bigger than any one person, even me." "That," Yasaka said, with the particular warmth she reserved for moments when he articulated something she found genuinely admirable, "is, I think, the clearest sign that what we have built here is going to last. Not because any single guardian, however powerful, holds it together through sheer personal capability, but because it has become an actual structure, with its own internal logic and its own capacity to grow and adapt beyond the limits of any individual's strength. The afternoon wore on into evening, lanterns being lit across the courtyard as the autumn light faded, and the gathering, rather than dispersing with the daylight, simply shifted into a different register, the formal diplomatic conversations giving way to something warmer and more relaxed, allied leaders and shrine residents alike settling into the easy camaraderie of people who had, over a year of shared challenge and shared success, become something considerably more than mere diplomatic contacts. Kuoh found Issei and Kuroka and Yasaka near the pond as full darkness settled over the mountains, the stars emerging bright and clear in the cold autumn sky, and she settled between them with the easy, unself-conscious affection that had characterized her relationship with all three of them from the very beginning. This was a good year, she said, with the particular simple certainty of someone summarizing something complex into its essential truth. I'm glad you came up the mountain, Issei. I know that sounds weird, since it was because of something bad happening to you. But I'm still glad. Yeah, Issei said, looking around at the gathered lanterns, the lingering guests, the people he had come to think of as family in every way that actually mattered, the territory that hummed beneath them with the patient, steady strength of leylines well tended and a community genuinely thriving. Yeah, me too, Kuoh. Me too. He thought briefly of the version of himself who had walked out of the Gremory clubroom a year before, exhausted and humiliated and uncertain of anything except that he could not stay somewhere that valued him only for the parts that were convenient. He thought of how far that version of himself would have to travel, in every sense, to recognize the life that had grown from that single, desperate decision to keep walking up a mountain path because some distant, half-formed hope suggested that something better might be waiting at the top. It had been waiting. More than he could have imagined, more than he had dared hope for in his most optimistic moments during that long, rain-soaked walk a year ago. A home. A purpose. A family built not from obligation but from genuine, chosen love. A territory transformed from isolated vulnerability into the center of something new and good and growing in the world. The leylines hummed beneath the mountain, ancient and patient and entirely his now, in every sense that mattered, and Issei Hyoudou, guardian of Kyoto, Senjutsu Dragon Emperor, sat surrounded by everyone who had become his family in the space of a single transformative year, and found, looking around at all of it, the lanterns and the stars and the people he loved gathered close, that he had absolutely nothing left to wish for that he did not already, completely and abundantly, have. The mountain held its silence, patient and ancient, the way it always had and always would. But within that silence now lived something it had not held for centuries, perhaps not ever in quite this particular configuration. A guardian who had come to it not seeking power but seeking purpose, and had found, in the giving of himself to something larger, more power and more purpose than he could have imagined, returned to him 100-fold by every person who had chosen, in turn, to give themselves to what he had helped build. The story of Kyoto's guardian, the East's protector, was far from finished. The hero faction's broader campaign continued its slow, patient pressure against the wider supernatural world, and there would be more nights like the winter assault, more communities needing rapid intervention, more diplomatic work and careful institution building stretching ahead across the centuries that the bond had granted him. But for tonight, beneath the autumn stars, surrounded by everyone who mattered most, none of that future urgency intruded on the simple, complete contentment of the present moment. Tonight was for the gathering, for the gratitude, for the quiet, profound recognition of how far a single act of refusing to walk past someone in need had carried all of them. Tonight, the sovereign of Kyoto was simply, fully, gratefully home. Chapter 20. Winter returned to the mountains a second time, and with it came the council that Shinra had proposed in the autumn, the first formal gathering of what would come to be known, in the years that followed, as the Eastern Concordat, the governance structure that finally gave shape and permanence to the alliance network Kyoto had spent a full year building from instinct and necessity into something resembling deliberate institution. The gathering took place not at the shrine itself, which Yasaka felt carried too much the character of Kyoto's particular leadership rather than the shared, distributed structure they were trying to build, but at a new facility constructed over the preceding months in a valley roughly equidistant from Kyoto, the Chugoku settlement, and the Kitsune community in Okayama. A deliberate symbolic choice that Shinra had advocated for with the patient persistence of a man who understood that the architecture of cooperation needed to be built into physical space as much as into agreements and good intentions. Representatives arrived from each of the 9 communities that had, over the preceding year, formally joined the network. Hachira came from Chugoku, visibly more confident than he had been even at the anniversary gathering, his community's defensive infrastructure now robust enough that he no longer carried the particular wariness of a man whose people remained fundamentally exposed. The Kitsune elder from Okayama attended in person this time, accompanied by 2 of the young defenders who had survived the rogue exorcist attack and had since become, with Kuroka's continued instruction, genuinely formidable practitioners in their own right. Smaller delegations arrived from the other 6 allied communities, each one carrying its own particular history of vulnerability transformed, over months of careful work, into something approaching genuine security. Issei watched the gathering assemble with a particular quality of wonder that had not entirely faded despite a full year of watching the network grow. 9 communities. 9 groups of people who had, a year before, existed in the same isolated vulnerability that had nearly cost Yasaka her life on a rain-soaked mountain path, now sitting together in a single room, discussing not survival but governance, not desperate defense but deliberate, shared strategy for the future. The structure I propose, Shinra said, opening the council's formal proceedings with the careful precision of a man who had spent considerable time refining exactly this presentation, is one of shared responsibility rather than singular authority. Kyoto's guardian and Lady Yasaka's leadership remained central to the network's founding and its continued strength, but the Concordat itself should be governed by a rotating council, with each member community holding equal voice in matters of shared defense, shared intelligence, and the terms under which new communities might join. The discussion that followed lasted the better part of 2 days, the kind of careful, sometimes contentious negotiation that genuine institution building required, communities advocating for their particular needs and concerns, questions raised about resource allocation, about how rapidly new members should be vetted and integrated, about the specific protocols that should govern situations like the rogue exorcist attack on Okayama, where speed of response had mattered more than careful deliberation. Issei found himself, throughout these discussions, occupying a role that surprised him with its difference from the diplomatic work of the preceding year. Where the early outreach to the Tender family and the Citri house had required him to be persuasive, warm, an effective ambassador for a faction nobody yet trusted, this council work required something more like patient facilitation, helping communities that did not yet fully trust each other find common ground. Translating concerns expressed in different cultural idioms into language that could be heard and addressed by all parties. "You're good at this too," Kuroka observed, during a break in the second day's proceedings, watching him help broker a compromise between 2 communities with differing views on how quickly new alliance members should gain full voting rights within the Concordat. "I don't think I appreciated, until watching this, how much of what you do isn't really about power at all." "Power's useful," Issei said. "But you can't actually build something like this with power alone. You need people to trust the structure even when they disagree with a specific decision it makes. That only happens if everyone feels like they were genuinely heard, even when they don't get exactly what they wanted." "Where did you learn that?" Issei considered the question seriously. "Honestly? I think I always sort of knew it, even back in Kuoh, even when nobody was listening to me about it. I just never had anywhere to actually practice it before. Strategy in a raiding game and strategy in something like this, they're not that different, really. You're always trying to find the configuration where everyone's strengths actually get used, instead of getting ignored because they're inconvenient." By the end of the second day, the Eastern Concordat had its founding charter, carefully negotiated and broadly, if not universally, satisfying to all 9 founding communities. A rotating council, equal voice for all member settlements, shared protocols for intelligence distribution and rapid response, and a formal process for vetting and integrating new communities that balanced speed of protection against the careful verification necessary to prevent the network itself from being infiltrated or exploited. Yasaka, watching the charter's formal signing on the evening of the second day, found Issei afterward in the quiet corridor outside the main hall, the celebratory feast already beginning behind them. You did something remarkable today, she said. Not merely facilitating this council, but building, I think, a model for exactly how isolated communities can become something genuinely greater than the sum of their individual vulnerabilities. This will outlast both of us, Issei. Long after either of our names are remembered by anyone beyond historical record, the structure built this week will likely still be protecting people who have not yet been born. I didn't build it alone, Issei said. Shinra designed the actual structure. You gave it the credibility to get communities to even show up and take it seriously. Kuroka built the practical training infrastructure that made joining the network actually mean something concrete. I helped people talk to each other. That's all I really did. That, Yasaka said, with the particular warmth that meant she found his characteristic humility both endearing and slightly maddening, is precisely the skill that made all the rest of it possible, Issei. Do not diminish it simply because it does not look, on its surface, as dramatic as defeating hero faction operatives in combat. The patient work of helping people trust each other enough to build something lasting together, that is, in the end, the rarer and more valuable skill. They returned to the feast together, the 9 communities celebrating not merely a successful negotiation but the formal recognition of something that had been growing, quietly and steadily, for a full year, the transformation of isolated vulnerability into collective strength, of desperate necessity into deliberate, durable institution. The following morning, before the various delegations departed back toward their respective territories, Hachiro approached Issei privately, his expression carrying a particular gravity that suggested something beyond ordinary diplomatic courtesy. I wanted to tell you something, the Tanuki elder said before I returned home. When you first came to my valley, nearly a year ago now, I did not fully believe what you were telling us. I thought, perhaps, that you were exaggerating the threat, or that your motives were more complicated than simple warning and assistance. I have thought, many times since, about how close I came to dismissing you entirely, and what would have happened to my people if I had. You didn't dismiss us, Issei said. That's what mattered. I came close. And I think, watching what has grown from that decision, watching the Concordat formed this week, I understand now something I did not understand before. The thing you offered us was not merely protection. It was the recognition that we mattered enough to be protected, that our survival was not simply our own private burden to carry alone, the way it had always been before. Hachiro's expression carried the particular weight of a very old man articulating something that had taken him considerable time to fully understand. That recognition, Issei, that is the actual gift you have given to every community in this Concordat. Not merely the practical defense, valuable as that is. The simple, profound fact of being seen as worth protecting. Issei felt the weight of this settle into him, the particular resonance of words that connected directly back to his own experience, the gift he had received from Yasaka on that first morning in the shrine, transformed and passed forward to 9 communities who had needed exactly the same thing he had needed, a year before, standing in a courtyard with nowhere left to go and nothing left to lose. Thank you for telling me that, he said. I think honestly, that's the thing I needed most too, when I first got here. Being seen as worth something beyond what I could do for someone else's strategy. Hachiro nodded slowly, the understanding between them complete and requiring no further elaboration, and the two of them stood together for a moment in the cold winter morning, watching the various delegations prepare for their journeys home, each one carrying back to their own communities not merely formal agreements, but the lived experience of having been heard, valued, and included in something larger than any of them could have built alone. The Eastern Concordat's first council session concluded, and as the delegations dispersed across the snow-covered mountains toward their separate homes, Issei stood with Yasaka and Kuroka and Kunu, watching them go, the particular satisfaction of having built something that would continue growing and strengthening long beyond this single gathering settling warm and certain in his chest. 9 communities, Kunu said, with the particular wonder of someone still young enough to find the scale of accomplishment genuinely astonishing rather than simply expected. A year ago it was just us. A year ago, Issei agreed, it was just us. He looked at the 3 of them, the family that had grown from that single desperate decision on a rain-soaked mountain path, and felt the full weight and warmth of everything that single year had built. I think that's kind of the whole point, though. It doesn't stay just us. It's not supposed to. The whole idea was always that nobody should have to be just us, alone and exposed, and hoping help arrives in time. Now there's 9 of us. And there'll be more. There will, Yasaka agreed softly, taking his hand as the last of the delegations disappeared down the snowy mountain road. The Concordat's founding charter carried back to 9 communities that would, in turn, carry its principles and its protections forward to however many more communities the coming years would bring into its growing, patient embrace. The mountain held its ancient silence around them, the leylines humming steady and strong beneath the snow, and somewhere in that vast, patient network of earth and energy and chosen family, something that had begun as a single act of refusing to walk past someone in need continued, quietly and steadily, to become something larger than any single person, however powerful, could ever have built alone. Chapter 21. The hero faction's response to a full year of failure took longer to materialize than anyone at the shrine had expected, and when it finally came, in the depths of the second winter since Issei's arrival, it arrived not as another direct assault but as something considerably more calculated, a development that Shinra, reviewing the intelligence as it filtered in through the Concordat's now well-established network, described with grim respect as exactly the kind of adaptation a genuinely capable adversary would eventually attempt. They are not trying to break the network through force any longer, Shinra explained, spreading a series of reports across the study table on a cold evening in late winter, the snow falling steadily beyond the paper screens. They have apparently concluded, correctly, that direct assault against any individual Concordat member now carries unacceptable costs, given the network's rapid response capability and the deepening alliance with the 3 factions. Instead, they appear to be attempting something more insidious. Infiltration of the Concordat's own structure. What does that mean exactly? Issei asked, leaning forward to examine the reports. 3 of the smaller communities that requested membership in the Concordat over the past 2 months have raised certain concerns among the council, subtle inconsistencies in their stated histories, representatives whose backgrounds cannot be fully verified through existing channels. Requests for information about our defensive protocols that exceed what would typically be necessary for a community still in the early stages of alliance integration. Shinra's expression was grave. I do not believe all 3 are compromised. But I believe at least one likely represents an attempt to embed hero faction sympathizers, or possibly direct operatives, within the Concordat's own structure, with the goal of gathering the kind of detailed intelligence about our defensive capabilities that would allow a future, more carefully targeted assault to succeed where direct confrontation has consistently failed. Issei absorbed this with the particular cold clarity that genuine strategic threats had come, over the past year, to produce in him, the leyline granted patience allowing him to process the implications without panic even as the seriousness of the threat registered fully. This is smart, he said slowly. Smarter than anything they've tried before. If they can get someone inside the Concordat's actual decision-making structure, they don't need to break through our defenses directly. They just need someone who already has legitimate access to tell them where the gaps are, precisely. And it represents a genuine challenge to the structure we have built, because the entire premise of the Concordat depends on trust between member communities, on the assumption that alliance, once granted, represents genuine good faith rather than calculated infiltration. If we respond by treating every new community with the kind of suspicion this threat would justify, we risk undermining the very thing that has made the network successful, the rapid, trusting integration of vulnerable communities into genuine protection. So what do we do? Kuroka asked, who had joined the conversation partway through, her expression carrying the particular focus she brought to any problem involving the specific kind of careful, patient threat assessment that her years of survival had made her genuinely expert at recognizing. I believe, Shinra said, that we need a verification process that is rigorous without being so slow or so suspicious that it undermines the trust the network depends on. And I believe, Issei, that your particular abilities may offer a solution that would not otherwise be available to us. What do you mean? The leyline bond. You sense, with remarkable precision, the quality and nature of spiritual energy within Kyoto's own territory. I wonder whether that same sensitivity, applied directly to individuals seeking to join the Concordat, might allow you to perceive deception or hidden hostile intent in a way that ordinary diplomatic vetting cannot. Issei considered this carefully. I've never tried that specifically. Reading a person's intent, rather than just sensing the energy of a place. Perhaps it is worth attempting, with appropriate care, and with the explicit consent of those being assessed. A new community representative told plainly that part of the Concordat's verification process now involves an audience with Kyoto's guardian, in which the guardian will attempt to sense whether the representative's stated intentions align with their actual purpose. Those with genuine, good faith intentions to join the alliance should have nothing to fear from such an assessment. Those attempting infiltration would face a verification method they likely have not anticipated and cannot easily counter. The first opportunity to test this approach came 2 weeks later, when a delegation arrived from a small community in the mountains near Tottori, requesting formal Concordat membership. Issei met with their representative, a young yokai woman who introduced herself as Mei, in the same quiet study where so much of the network's careful diplomatic work had been conducted over the preceding year, and as the conversation proceeded, he found himself extending his awareness in a way he had never deliberately attempted before, reaching not toward the land but toward the person sitting across from him. Feeling for the particular quality of her spiritual energy, the way intent and emotion seemed to leave traces in the currents of a person's presence the same way they left traces in the land itself. What he found, to his considerable relief, was simple, uncomplicated sincerity, the genuine, slightly nervous hope of someone whose community had heard about the Concordat's protection and wanted, desperately and honestly, to be included in it. There was no hidden current of deception, no carefully suppressed alternate purpose, simply the straightforward truth of someone asking for help because help was genuinely needed. Welcome to the Concordat, Issei told her, and meant it completely, the relief of confirmed genuine need settling warm and certain in his chest. The second test, conducted the following week with a representative from one of the 3 communities Shinra had flagged as potentially compromised, told a very different story. Issei felt it almost immediately upon beginning the conversation, a careful, practiced layer of false warmth overlaying something colder and more calculating beneath, the particular quality of someone performing sincerity rather than feeling it, every word and gesture carefully calibrated to produce a specific impression rather than emerging naturally from genuine intent. He did not confront the representative directly. Instead, following the careful plan he and Shinra had developed in advance precisely for this scenario, he concluded the conversation with polite, non-committal courtesy, indicating that the Concordat's council would review the membership request and respond in due course, and the representative departed apparently satisfied that the meeting had proceeded as expected. He's not genuine, Issei told Shinra and Yasaka immediately afterward, the certainty of the leyline granted perception leaving no room for doubt. There's a real performance there, real effort to seem sincere, but underneath it there's something calculating, something cold. He's not coming here because his community needs protection. He's coming here to find out things about how we operate. Then we have our answer, Shinra said, his expression grim but satisfied in the particular way of someone whose theory has been confirmed even when the confirmation itself is unwelcome. The question now is how we respond. We could simply deny the membership request, citing unspecified concerns. That protects us but reveals little about the broader scope of the infiltration attempt. Or we could allow limited, carefully managed engagement, gathering intelligence about exactly what this individual, and whoever directs him, is actually trying to learn, while controlling precisely what information he is able to access. The second option is riskier, Yasaka said. It is. But it may also be considerably more valuable, if managed correctly. We would learn not merely that infiltration was attempted, but specifically what the hero faction, or whoever is directing this individual, believes is worth learning about our defenses. That information itself would be significant. Issei thought about this, the particular calculation of risk against potential strategic value that had become, over the past year, an increasingly familiar part of his role within the Alliance's leadership. I think we should try the second approach, he said finally. Carefully. We control exactly what he sees and hears, we make sure nothing genuinely sensitive is accessible to him, and we watch closely what he asks about, and what he reports back, if we can track that. It's a calculated risk, but I think the information's worth it, as long as we're careful about containment. The operation that followed, conducted over the subsequent month with the careful coordination of Issei's perceptive abilities, Kuroka's practical intelligence experience, and Shinra's patient strategic oversight, revealed exactly the pattern Shinra had suspected. The infiltrator, whose name turned out to be assumed rather than genuine, was indeed working on behalf of a faction connected to, though apparently somewhat independent from, the main hero faction organization, tasked specifically with identifying the Concordat's verification protocols, its rapid response capabilities, and most concerning, the specific nature of Issei's leyline bond and whether it represented a vulnerability that might be exploited. They're trying to understand exactly what I am, Issei said, reviewing the intelligence the operation had gathered, so they can figure out if there's a way to neutralize the bond specifically, rather than just trying to overwhelm us with force. That is my assessment as well, Shinra said. Which suggests, Issei, that you have become, in their strategic calculation, the single most significant obstacle to their broader campaign. They no longer believe they can simply outlast or overwhelm the Alliance network through conventional means. They believe, instead, that removing or neutralizing you specifically might collapse the network's effectiveness considerably more than any other single action they could take. The weight of this settled into Issei with genuine seriousness, the recognition that he had become, in a way he had not fully anticipated even after a year of expanding responsibility, a specific and deliberate target rather than simply one element of a broader defensive structure. Does that scare you? Kuroka asked him quietly. Later that evening, the two of them sitting together in the quiet aftermath of processing the intelligence operations findings. Issei considered the question seriously, checking, as he had learned to do, whether the easy, reassuring answer was actually true rather than simply convenient. A little, he admitted. Not for myself, exactly. I trust the bond, I trust what we've built here, I trust the people around me. But it makes me think about what happens to everything we've built if they actually find a way to specifically target me. The Concordat, the alliances, all of it, how much of it depends on me personally still being here and able to do what I do? Less than you might think, Kuroka said, with the particular flat certainty that characterized her most considered observations. I have watched this network grow for over a year now, Issei. It began depending almost entirely on you, yes. But it has grown beyond that. Shinra's structures, the Concordat's own governance, the trained practitioners scattered now across 9 communities, the relationships with the 3 factions that exist independent of any single person's continued involvement. If something happened to you, this would not collapse. It would grieve, profoundly, and it would be diminished. But it would not collapse. She held his gaze steadily. You built something that no longer needs you to survive, even though it would be considerably poorer without you. I think that is, in fact, the clearest measure of how well you have built it. Issei absorbed this, the particular comfort and the particular gravity of it both landing fully, and found that Kuroka's assessment, rather than diminishing his sense of purpose, actually clarified it, the recognition that what mattered was not his individual indispensability but the durability of what he had helped create. I still want to be here for all of it, he said. Not because the network needs me to survive. Because I want to keep being part of it, keep watching it grow, keep being with you and Yasaka and Kuno for as long as that bond gives us. Then we will simply have to make sure, Kuroka said, that whatever the hero faction is planning, it does not succeed. We have not failed to meet a challenge yet, Issei. I do not intend for this to be the first. The weeks that followed saw the gradual, careful expulsion of the confirmed infiltrator and a quiet but thorough review of every Concordat member's verification, conducted now with the additional layer of Issei's perceptive ability applied retroactively to existing members as well, a process that revealed, to everyone's relief, that the infiltration attempt had been limited to the single individual they had identified, the broader network remaining genuinely, thoroughly trustworthy. But the underlying message remained, settling into the strategic awareness of everyone involved in the Concordat's leadership. The hero faction had not given up. It had simply changed its approach, and would likely continue changing it, probing for whatever weakness might eventually prove exploitable in a structure that had, over the preceding year, proven remarkably resistant to every direct assault attempted against it. The war, if war was the right word for the long, patient, evolving conflict between an alliance built on genuine care and an organization built on ideological elimination, was far from over. It would likely continue, in one form or another, for years, perhaps for the full span of the centuries the leyline bond had granted Issei. But standing in the snow-covered courtyard of the shrine on a cold winter evening, surrounded by the family he had built and the network of allies that family had, in turn, helped construct across an entire region, Issei found that the prospect of years and decades and centuries of continued vigilance did not frighten him. It felt, instead, like exactly the kind of long, worthwhile work that a life built on genuine purpose was supposed to contain. Not a burden carried alone, the way Yasaka had carried it for so many centuries before his arrival, but a shared, sustainable responsibility, distributed now across 9 communities and growing, each one strengthening the whole, each one making the next challenge, whatever form it eventually took, considerably more survivable than it would have been a year before. The leylines hummed beneath the snow, ancient and patient and entirely alive, carrying within their depths the accumulated strength of a territory, and now a region that had learned, through hard experience and careful, deliberate effort, exactly what it meant to no longer stand alone. Whatever came next, they would meet it together. And together, Issei had come to understand over this remarkable, transformative year, was very nearly always enough. The Sovereign of Kyoto. Act 5, Chapter 22. The second anniversary of Issei's arrival in Kyoto passed quietly, marked by nothing more dramatic than a private dinner among the 4 of them and a brief, warm exchange of memories about how far they had all traveled since that rain-soaked night on the mountain. But the quiet of that anniversary belied the storm that had been gathering, slowly and almost invisibly, in the wider currents of the supernatural world, and within a month of the gathering, the storm broke. It began with a name. Chow Chow. Shinra brought the intelligence to the morning briefing with the particular grim economy he reserved for developments he had been dreading, a single sheet of paper that summarized, with unusual brevity for his typically thorough reports, the substance of what the 3 factions' shared network had pieced together over the preceding weeks. The hero faction's true leadership has finally surfaced clearly enough for identification, he said. A man calling himself Chow Chow, claiming descent from the historical figure of the same name, wielding what our intelligence suggests is true Longinus, the spear said to have pierced the side of Christ himself. He has, over the past several months, been quietly consolidating control over various splinter factions and rogue exorcist groups that had previously operated with considerable independence, including, we now believe, the group responsible for the Okayama attack and the infiltration attempt against the Concordat. He's unifying them, Issei said, the weight of the implication settling immediately. Bringing everything under one command. Precisely. And unification of that kind typically precedes, rather than follows, major coordinated action. I believe, Issei, that the patient, probing campaign we have weathered for the past 2 years has been, in some sense, preparation. Testing our defenses, identifying our weaknesses, gathering the kind of detailed intelligence about the Concordat's structure that would allow for a genuinely decisive strike, once the organization itself was unified enough to execute one. Yasaka's expression, listening to this, had gone very still, the particular stillness Issei had learned to recognize as her processing something genuinely dangerous rather than merely concerning. True Longinus, she said. If the reports of its capability are accurate, that weapon alone represents a threat considerably beyond anything we have faced from the hero faction previously. It is said to be capable of striking down even the divine. The reports from Azazel's intelligence network suggest the weapon's reputation is not exaggerated, Shinra confirmed. Chow Chow himself is reported to be extraordinarily capable even without the spear, a master strategist and combatant who has survived and thrived within an organization that has, historically, consumed lesser leaders quickly. The fact that he has risen to unify the hero faction's various factions suggests considerable political as well as martial skill. Issei absorbed this, feeling the familiar cold clarity of genuine strategic threat settling into him, though tempered now, after 2 years of practice, by the particular patience the leyline bond had granted him, the ability to feel the weight of danger without being overwhelmed by it. What do we know about his actual plans? He asked. Less than I would like. But there are patterns in recent hero faction movement that suggest a buildup of resources in the Kansai region specifically, rather than the scattered activity against isolated communities that has characterized the organization's approach until now. I believe, though I cannot yet confirm with certainty, that Cao Cao intends a direct strike against Kyoto itself, the Concordat's founding territory and, by extension, its symbolic and practical heart. The room was quiet for a long moment, the weight of the implication settling fully into everyone present. If he takes Kyoto, Kuroka said slowly, the Concordat doesn't just lose its strongest member. It loses its center. The thing that gives the whole network its legitimacy, and its coordinating structure. That is my assessment as well, Shinra said. Which means, Issei, that whatever Cao Cao is planning, however long the preparation has taken, we should expect that the actual strike, when it comes, will be significant. Possibly the largest coordinated action the hero faction has attempted in living memory. Yasaka's hand found Issei's beneath the table, her grip firm and grounding. We have built considerable strength over these 2 years, she said. The Concordat's combined resources, the relationships with the 3 factions, your own continued growth as guardian. We are not facing this the way we would have faced it 2 years ago, alone and unprepared. No, Issei agreed. But we should still take this seriously. Really seriously. Not just preparing defensively, but actually trying to understand what Cao Cao wants, what would actually stop him from attacking, whether there's any room for the kind of diplomatic resolution we've managed with everyone else we've encountered. You want to try to talk to him, Kuroka said, not quite a question, the particular flat skepticism in her voice suggesting she had her doubts about the wisdom of the approach even as she recognized it as exactly the kind of thing Issei would propose. I want to understand him before I assume there's no other option besides fighting him, Issei said. That's worked for everyone else we've encountered who started out hostile. The Tenda family, Sona, even the rogue communities that joined the Concordat after we showed up uninvited. I don't know if it'll work with someone running an organization built around eliminating supernatural beings as a founding principle, but I think it's worth finding out before we commit to the assumption that this has to end in a massive fight. Shinra considered this with the careful weighing of a man who had learned, over 2 years of watching Issei's instincts prove correct more often than seemed statistically reasonable, not to dismiss this kind of suggestion out of hand. There may be a channel, he said slowly. Azazel has maintained, through certain fallen angel intelligence contacts, indirect lines of communication with several figures adjacent to the hero faction's leadership, including, I believe, at least one connection that could plausibly reach Cao Cao himself, if approached carefully. I would caution, however, that Cao Cao's reputation suggests someone who values strength and capability considerably more than sentiment, or appeal to shared interest. A diplomatic approach with him would need to be calibrated very differently than our previous successes. Then let's figure out how to calibrate it, Issei said. Before we assume the only path forward is the one that ends with everyone fighting. They reached out to Azazel that same day, and his response, arriving within hours given the urgency of the matter, carried both genuine interest in the proposal and a note of careful warning that Issei read several times before fully absorbing its weight. Cao Cao, Azazel's message explained, was not motivated by simple hatred of supernatural beings, the way the hero faction's founding ideology might suggest to an outside observer. He was motivated, instead, by something more complicated and, in its own way, more dangerous, a genuine belief that the current order of supernatural power, concentrated among ancient beings and inherited sacred gears, represented a fundamental injustice that needed correcting, regardless of the cost required to correct it. He saw himself, Azazel's intelligence suggested, not as a monster but as a necessary historical force, the human equivalent of beings who had wielded power over humanity for millennia finally claiming the agency that had been denied them. That's almost, Issei said, reading the assessment carefully, that's almost a position I could understand, even if I don't agree with the methods. Like, I get being angry about systems that don't give people a say in their own fate. I was on the wrong end of that for 2 years before I came here. The difference, Yasaka said carefully, is that your response to that injustice was to build something inclusive, something that gave voice and protection to those who had previously been denied both. Cao Cao's response, from everything we know of his methods, has been to seek the elimination of an entire category of beings he perceives as the source of the injustice, rather than working to transform the system that produced it. Right. I know. I'm not saying his methods are okay. I'm saying I might actually be able to find something to talk to him about, some shared frustration with how things have worked historically, even if we end up completely disagreeing about what the solution should look like. Issei looked at the assembled group, his expression carrying the particular determined clarity that had characterized his approach to every previous diplomatic challenge. I think it's worth trying. Even if it doesn't work, even if he just laughs at the idea of negotiating with me, at least we'll know for certain that this has to be settled through strength rather than dialogue, instead of assuming it from the start. Azazel arranged the meeting within 2 weeks, a careful, heavily mediated arrangement at a neutral location far enough from Kyoto's own territory that any betrayal would not directly threaten the heart of the alliance network, but significant enough in its formality to signal that both sides understood the stakes involved. Issei traveled with Kuroka and a small contingent of Concordat representatives, Yasaka remaining at the shrine, the decision made jointly and without significant argument, the recognition that the territory's actual protectors should not be risked unnecessarily in a meeting whose outcome remained genuinely uncertain, particularly given the unprecedented danger that true Longinus represented. Cao Cao, when Issei finally met him in person, was not what he had expected. Where he had braced for someone radiating obvious menace or fanatical zealotry, he found instead a man of measured, almost scholarly composure, dark hair and sharp, assessing eyes, a presence that carried genuine charisma without any of the theatrical menace Issei had unconsciously prepared himself to encounter. The Sekyudai, Cao Cao said by way of greeting, his voice carrying the particular quality of someone who had clearly studied his opponent extensively before the meeting. Or perhaps I should say, the Senjutsu Dragon Emperor, given the considerable transformation you have apparently undergone since leaving Kuoh. I confess your situation has been one of the more genuinely interesting developments I have observed in recent years. I could say the same about you, Issei replied, matching the measured composure as best he could, drawing on 2 years of diplomatic practice to keep his tone open rather than defensive. Building an organization, unifying factions that have apparently operated independently for a long time, that's not nothing either. Flattery or genuine assessment? Cao Cao's expression carried a faint, considering amusement. Genuine assessment. I don't really do flattery, honestly. I've found it usually just gets in the way of actually understanding the person you're talking to. Issei held his gaze steadily. And I'd like to actually understand you, if that's possible. Before we end up in a situation where understanding each other doesn't matter anymore because everything's already been decided by force. Cao Cao studied him for a long moment, and Issei felt, beneath the man's composed exterior, something that registered, through the particular sensitivity the ley line bond had granted him, as genuine intellectual engagement rather than mere tactical posturing. Very well, Cao Cao said finally. Let us talk, Sekyudai. I am curious to discover whether the reputation building around you, the diplomat who has turned isolated vulnerability into regional strength, the dragon who somehow makes alliance feel like genuine kinship rather than mere strategic convenience, whether that reputation reflects something real, or whether it is simply the kind of story that grows around any sufficiently dramatic rise to power, regardless of the actual substance underneath. Let's find out, Issei said, and the conversation that followed, over the next several hours, became one of the most significant and most precarious diplomatic engagements of Issei's entire 2 years as Kyoto's guardian. Chapter 23. The conversation between Issei and Cao Cao unfolded across the long afternoon in careful, deliberate stages, each man testing the other's positions with the patient thoroughness of skilled strategists who recognized, in their counterpart, a mind worth taking seriously rather than dismissing. Tell me, Cao Cao said, partway through the exchange, what you believe the fundamental injustice of the current supernatural order actually is. Not the diplomatic version, the one calibrated to make me feel heard without actually conceding anything substantive. The real version, the one you would tell someone you trusted completely. Issei considered the question seriously, recognizing in it a genuine test rather than mere rhetorical positioning. I think the fundamental injustice, he said slowly, is that power gets concentrated in beings who've had it for centuries or millennia, and the people without that inherited power, human and supernatural both, end up having to just accept whatever arrangement those powerful beings decide to allow. I lived that, actually, before I came here. I was a pawn in a devil peerage, which meant my entire worth, in the eyes of the people who controlled my situation, was measured by how useful I was to their existing power structure. The moment I stopped being convenient, I stopped mattering, regardless of what I actually had to offer. He held Chow Chow's gaze steadily. I think that's real. I think it's a real problem, and I don't think the three factions' current arrangement actually solves it, even with the peace agreement, even with whatever progress has been made. It just means the existing powerful beings agree not to fight each other directly, while everyone below them in the hierarchy still has to live with whatever crumbs of consideration that arrangement happens to leave for them. Chow Chow's expression had sharpened with genuine interest during this answer, the careful, assessing quality replaced, briefly, by something more direct. That is considerably more honest than I expected. Most who attempt to negotiate with me arrive prepared with careful diplomatic language designed to minimize disagreement rather than actually articulate it. He paused. If you believe the injustice is real, why do you continue building alliances with the very factions you believe perpetuate it? Why work with devil houses, with the fallen angels, with an angel faction that has, historically, treated supernatural beings outside its own hierarchy with considerable disdain? Because I don't think the solution is eliminating them, Issei said. I think the solution is building something that doesn't depend on their goodwill to survive, while also showing them, through actual demonstrated success, that there's a better way to do this than the hierarchy they're used to. The Concordat doesn't exist because the three factions decided to grant it legitimacy. It exists because we built it ourselves, from nothing, and now it's strong enough that the three factions have to actually engage with it as something real, something they can't simply ignore or dismiss. That's different from begging for inclusion in a system that was never built to include people like the communities in our network. It's building a different system entirely, and proving it works better, and if that different system eventually grows large enough, strong enough, to challenge the three factions' existing dominance directly? What then? Issei thought about this carefully, recognizing the question as the actual heart of what Chow Chow wanted to understand about him. Then I think we negotiate from a position of actual strength, instead of having to ask for permission to exist, he said. But I don't think the goal has to be replacing them. I think the goal can just be making sure nobody else has to be in the position I was in, or the position the Yokai faction was in before I got here, dependent entirely on someone else's mercy for their basic survival and dignity. I think there's room in the world for multiple kinds of power existing alongside each other, as long as none of them depend on crushing the others to maintain their own position. Chow Chow was quiet for a long moment, his expression carrying the particular stillness of someone genuinely reconsidering a previously settled position, even if only slightly. You are describing, he said finally, a vision of coexistence that I confess I have rarely encountered articulated with this much specificity, or this much evidence of actually having been attempted in practice rather than merely theorized about. The hero faction's founding premise holds that supernatural beings, by their nature, cannot be trusted to share power without eventually using it to subjugate humanity, the way they have subjugated humanity for the entirety of recorded history. Your network, the Concordat, represents a counterexample to that premise. If it continues to succeed, if it continues to demonstrate that supernatural power and human flourishing are not fundamentally opposed, that would constitute a genuine challenge to the ideological foundation my organization is built upon. I think that's kind of the point, Issei said. Not to destroy your organization through force, but to make its founding premise actually wrong, through evidence, through what we're actually building. I'd rather win that argument by being right than by being stronger. A noble sentiment. But sentiment alone has rarely stopped organizations built around genuine ideological conviction, Sekirudai. Beliefs held strongly enough survive considerable contrary evidence, particularly when the believers have invested years, sometimes lifetimes, in the conviction's truth. Chow Chow's expression carried, for the first time, something that might have been genuine regret rather than mere strategic calculation. I do not doubt the sincerity of what you have built. I have reviewed considerable intelligence on the Concordat's actual function, and it appears, by every measure available to me, to represent exactly the kind of genuine, voluntary cooperation you describe. But I cannot simply abandon an organization and a mission that I have spent years building and unifying, on the strength of a single conversation, however genuinely it has caused me to reconsider certain assumptions. I'm not asking you to abandon everything immediately, Issei said. I'm asking whether there's room to find out if there's a path forward that doesn't end in a massive fight that costs a huge number of lives on both sides, supernatural and human both, including, probably, a lot of the people in your own organization who joined for reasons that might actually have more in common with what we're trying to build than either of us initially assumed. Chow Chow considered this for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his tone carried a particular careful weight, the sound of someone genuinely working through a difficult internal calculation rather than performing diplomatic consideration for an audience. I will offer you this, he said finally. I will not call off the broader campaign entirely. There are factions within my own organization who would not accept such a reversal, and who would likely fracture from my leadership if I attempted it, potentially creating a more chaotic and less controllable threat than the one we currently present. But I am willing to delay the specific action planned against Kyoto, and to engage in further dialogue, both with you directly and through the channels Azazel has established, while I observe whether the Concordat's success continues, and whether the evidence it provides against my organization's founding premise holds up to continued scrutiny over time. This is not peace, Hyoudou. It is, at most, a considered pause, and a genuine willingness to continue this conversation rather than assume its conclusion has already been determined by ideology alone. Issei felt the weight of this settle into him, recognizing it as considerably more than he had dared hope for when the meeting began, and considerably less than the full resolution he would have preferred, but a genuine, meaningful step nonetheless. I'll take that, he said. And I'd like to suggest something else, if you're open to it. Not asking your people to abandon their beliefs. Just an actual ongoing dialogue. Maybe regular meetings, like this one, where we keep testing the actual evidence against each other's positions, instead of just assuming we already know how it ends. That, Chow Chow said, with the faint, genuine quality of someone recognizing an idea with real merit, is a more interesting proposal than I expected to receive today. I will consider it seriously. He studied Issei for a long moment, his expression carrying something that might, in a different context, have approached respect. You are not what the reports from Kuoh described, Hyoudou. They described a brawler of unusual but conventional power. What I have encountered today is something considerably more dangerous to my organization's founding premise than raw strength could ever be. A genuine, demonstrated alternative. I'll take that as a compliment, Issei said. You should, Chow Chow replied, and for just a moment, something in his composed exterior shifted into what might, almost, have been the ghost of genuine warmth. Though I would not recommend underestimating me in turn, Hyoudou. The pause I have offered is real, but it is not unlimited, and my organization's broader mission has not been abandoned, merely, for the present, reconsidered in its specific application to your territory. Continue building what you are building. I will continue watching. And we will see, in time, which of our visions for the future the evidence ultimately supports. They parted on terms that Issei would later describe to Yasaka and the others as cautiously, fragilely hopeful, the kind of outcome that represented genuine progress without resolving the underlying tension that had brought them to the table in the first place. But progress, even fragile, even incomplete, was progress. And as Issei made the journey back toward Kyoto with Kuroka and the Concordat representatives who had accompanied him, he found himself turning over the conversation with the particular careful attention he gave to genuinely significant developments. You actually got through to him, Kuroka said, walking beside him through the spring evening, her expression carrying a complicated mixture of relief and continued wariness. I did not expect that to be possible. Most accounts of Chow Chow describe someone fundamentally immovable in his convictions. I don't think I changed his mind, exactly, Issei said. I think I gave him a reason to keep questioning it himself, instead of just accepting it as settled. That's different from victory. But it's not nothing either. No, Kuroka agreed. It is considerably more than nothing. She glanced at him, the spring starlight catching the silver of her hair. You continue to surprise me, Issei. Even after 2 years. Good surprise, I hope. The best kind, she said, and the warmth in her voice carried them the rest of the way home through the gathering dark, toward a territory that had, for the moment at least, been granted a fragile, hard-won space to continue growing into everything it was still becoming. Chapter 24. The pause Chow Chow had granted held for nearly 4 months, and in that time, the Concordat continued its careful, deliberate growth, 3 more communities joining the network, the regular dialogue Issei had proposed taking shape into a series of careful, mediated exchanges, sometimes conducted directly between Issei and Chow Chow, sometimes through intermediaries arranged by Azazel, who had taken to the role of facilitator with the particular enthusiasm of someone who genuinely believed in the possibility that this kind of dialogue might prevent the kind of large-scale conflict that history had taught him to dread. But the underlying tension never fully dissolved, and Shinra's continued vigilance through the intelligence networks they had built revealed, gradually, that not everyone within the hero faction's newly unified structure shared Chow Chow's willingness to reconsider the organization's founding assumptions. There is a faction within his own organization, Shinra reported, during a briefing held on a warm summer evening nearly 5 months after the initial meeting, that has grown increasingly frustrated with the pause in operations against Kyoto and the Concordat more broadly. Our intelligence suggests this faction is led by a man named Siegfried, one of the hero faction's most capable combatants, who has apparently begun questioning Chow Chow's leadership directly, arguing that the dialogue with you represents weakness rather than strategic patience. That's the risk we knew we were taking, Issei said. Chow Chow said as much himself. That pulling back too far could fracture his control over the organization. Indeed. And our most recent intelligence suggests that fracture may be approaching a critical point. If Siegfried's faction grows strong enough, or impatient enough, they may act independently of Chow Chow's authority entirely, launching an assault against the Concordat without his sanction, which would represent a considerably less predictable and potentially more dangerous threat than even Chow Chow's full coordinated campaign would have been. Yasaka's expression carried the particular gravity of someone recognizing a genuinely difficult strategic position. An unsanctioned faction acting outside Chow Chow's control would not be bound by whatever restraint he has shown in our dialogue. They could act with considerably less predictability, and considerably less concern for the kind of measured engagement that has characterized our interactions until now. We need to know more about Siegfried specifically, Issei said. What he wants, what would actually satisfy him or his faction, whether there's any room for the same kind of dialogue that's worked with Chow Chow, or whether he's just fundamentally a different kind of threat. The intelligence that followed, gathered over the subsequent weeks through Azazel's network and Kuroka's own careful inquiries among contacts she had maintained from her years of independent movement through the supernatural underworld, painted a picture of someone considerably less reflective than Chow Chow. A warrior whose primary motivation appeared to be the pursuit of combat against worthy opponents rather than any deeply held ideological conviction, someone who had been drawn to the hero faction less by its founding philosophy and more by the access it provided to exactly the kind of significant, dangerous engagements he sought. He's not a true believer the way Chow Chow seems to be, Kuroka reported, during a strategy session held in the study, the summer evening warm through the open screens. From what I've gathered, Siegfried's loyalty to the organization's founding mission is considerably more conditional. What he actually wants is worthy combat, recognition of his strength, the kind of significant battle that proves something about his own capability. The hero faction has simply been the vehicle that provides him access to that, given the kind of opponents its mission brings him into conflict with. Issei absorbed this with the particular cold clarity of recognizing both an opportunity and a genuine danger in the same piece of intelligence. If that's what he actually wants, he said slowly, then maybe there's a way to address it that doesn't require either surrendering to his demands or fighting an unsanctioned, unpredictable assault against the entire Concordat. You're not suggesting you fight him personally, Kuroka said, her tone carrying immediate, sharp concern. I'm saying I want to understand what would actually satisfy him, the same way I tried to understand what would satisfy Cao Cao. If what he wants is a legitimate, significant test of his strength, against an opponent he genuinely respects, maybe there's a way to give him that without it costing the Concordat everything we've built. Issei's expression carried the particular thoughtful quality that preceded his most significant strategic insights. Not a battle to the death. A real contest, with actual stakes, conducted on terms that don't put the broader network at risk regardless of the outcome. Yasaka's expression carried visible concern, the particular worry of someone who loved him deeply enough to find the prospect of him deliberately engaging a dangerous, unpredictable opponent genuinely difficult to accept calmly. Issei, this carries real risk. Siegfried's reputation for combat capability is significant. If you underestimate him, or if the contest terms are not carefully enough constructed to prevent it from escalating beyond what either side intends, the consequences could be severe. I know. I'm not suggesting this without taking the risk seriously. Issei met her gaze steadily, the particular grounded calm of 2 years of patient growth evident in his bearing. But I think the alternative, an unsanctioned faction launching an unpredictable assault against the whole Concordat, carries even greater risk, to a lot more people than just me. If there's a way to address Siegfried's actual motivation directly, in a controlled, agreed-upon context, that seems like the better path, even if it's not without genuine danger to me personally. The negotiation that followed, conducted carefully through Azazel's network with input from Cao Cao himself, who, Shinra noted with grim satisfaction, appeared genuinely relieved at the prospect of a resolution that might address Siegfried's growing dissent without requiring either full capitulation or a fracture within his own organization's leadership, eventually produced terms that all parties found acceptable, though none found entirely comfortable. A formal contest, conducted at a neutral location with representatives from the 3 factions present as witnesses and guarantors of fair conduct, Issei against Siegfried, with explicit terms preventing the engagement from escalating into lethal conflict, and with the outcome, regardless of which combatant prevailed, binding upon Siegfried's faction to respect the continued pause in hostilities against the Concordat for a defined additional period. This is still a significant risk, Yasaka said, the night before the contest was scheduled to occur, the two of them sitting together at the koi pond in the warm summer darkness, the particular quiet intimacy of the moment carrying real weight given what the following day held. I know, Issei said. But I think it's the right risk to take. And honestly, Yasaka, I think I'm ready for it. 2 years of this bond, 2 years of learning what the Senjutsu Dragon form can actually do, 2 years of fighting hero faction operatives and rogue exorcists, and everything else that's come at us. I'm not the same fighter I was when I first arrived here, half-trained and improvising everything as I went. I know you have grown considerably, Yasaka said softly. I have watched it happen, every day, with a kind of wonder I do not think I have ever fully expressed to you adequately. But Issei, growth and readiness do not eliminate genuine danger. Siegfried's reputation is considerable, and true Longinus's Wielder's faction is not the only significant threat in the hero faction's arsenal. I am not asking you to abandon this plan. I am simply asking you to understand that my concern comes from love, not from doubt in your capability. I know, Issei said, taking her hand, the familiar warmth and grounding of the gesture settling something steady in his chest. And I love you for that concern, even while I'm telling you I still think this is the right path. I promise you, I'm not doing this carelessly. I've thought about it as carefully as I've thought about anything in the past 2 years. Kuroka joined them partway through the conversation, settling on Issei's other side with the particular quiet solidarity that had characterized her presence through every significant challenge of the preceding years. I have fought beside you against considerable threats, she said, and I have watched you grow into something genuinely formidable, beyond what even the Senjutsu Dragon bond alone would suggest was possible. I do not say this lightly, Issei, because I do not offer reassurance simply for its own comfort. I believe you can win this contest. And if, against that belief, something goes wrong, I will be there, the moment the terms allow intervention, to ensure that wrong does not become catastrophic. Thank you, Issei said, the weight of having both women's support, offered honestly rather than as mere comfort, settling warm and significant in his chest. I'm going to need both of you, tomorrow and after, regardless of how it goes. They sat together for a long while in the summer darkness, the coin moving slow and patient beneath the water's surface, the leylines humming their steady, ancient song beneath the mountain, and somewhere in that quiet, accumulated strength of 2 years of careful building, Issei found the particular clarity and resolve that would carry him into the following day's contest, not without fear, but without being controlled by it. The particular balance of courage and care that had characterized everything he had built since first walking up this mountain with nothing but a duffel bag and a desperate hope that something better might be waiting at the top. It had been waiting. And tomorrow, he would fight to protect everything that hope had grown into. Chapter 25. The contest took place in a wide, open valley near the same neutral facility where the original 3 factions consultation had occurred 2 years before, the symmetry of the location not lost on Issei as he arrived in the early morning light. The summer air already warm, a crowd of observers gathered at a careful, respectful distance, representatives from the 3 factions, from the Concordat's member communities, and, on the opposing side, a contingent from the hero faction that included, to Issei's measured interest, Cao Cao himself, present as both witness and Issei suspected, as a kind of insurance against the contest spiraling beyond its agreed terms. Siegfried, when Issei finally saw him across the valley, carried the particular bearing of a warrior entirely comfortable with violence as both vocation and identity, pale hair and cold eyes, a massive sword strapped across his back that radiated holy light even at rest, the kind of presence that announced, without need for words, exactly what kind of opponent he intended to be. Security, Siegfried said, as the 2 of them took their positions at the valley's center, the gathered observers settling into expectant silence. I confess I did not expect Cao Cao's diplomatic experiment to produce someone I might actually find worth fighting. Most who attempt dialogue rather than combat tend to disappoint when violence finally becomes necessary. I'm not really here to disappoint or impress you, Issei said, settling into the particular calm readiness that 2 years of practice had built into him, the boosted gear materializing on his arm with its familiar crimson flash. I'm here because this seemed like the path that risked the fewest lives, including yours and mine. If we can settle whatever's driving your faction's impatience through this instead of through an actual war, I think that's worth doing properly. A practical answer. I respect practicality, even when I do not share its priorities. Siegfried drew his sword, the holy light intensifying along its blade. Let us see, then, whether your practicality extends to genuine strength, or whether it has simply been the convenient cover for an opponent who has not yet faced a true test. He moved first, and the speed of the attack told Issei immediately that every report about Siegfried's capability had been, if anything, understated. The holy sword descended in a blow that would have ended the contest in a single strike against the lesser opponent, and Issei met it with the boosted gear's gauntlet, the impact ringing across the valley like a thunderclap, the force of it driving him back several feet despite his braced stance. Boost, the gauntlet intoned, and Issei felt the familiar surge, the power doubling, and he answered Siegfried's follow-up strike with one of his own, channeling not merely the draconic force of the boosted gear but the deep, patient strength of the leylines themselves, the synthesis that Azazel had spent so much time studying and that Issei had spent 2 years learning to wield with genuine mastery rather than improvised instinct. The contest that followed unfolded across nearly 20 minutes of sustained, ferocious engagement, the 2 combatants testing each other's limits with an intensity that left the gathered observers, even those experienced in supernatural combat, visibly impressed by the sheer scale of power being exchanged. Siegfried's swordsmanship was genuinely masterful, each strike calculated and precise, his holy light blade carving through the air with a speed that taxed even Issei's enhanced perception to track fully. But Issei's own combination of draconic power and leyline-granted spiritual sensitivity gave him something Siegfried's pure martial mastery could not match, the ability to sense, a fraction of a second before each strike landed, the precise angle and timing of his opponent's next movement, allowing him to redirect rather than simply absorb the considerable force being brought against him. Boost, the gauntlet said, a 3rd time, then a 4th, the power accumulating with each exchange, and Issei felt the particular, familiar clarity that the combination of escalating draconic strength and the leylines' patient guidance produced in him, the sense of being exactly where he needed to be, doing exactly what the moment required. Siegfried, for his part, seemed to grow more genuinely engaged rather than frustrated as the contest continued, his expression shifting from the cold, assessing focus of its beginning into something that carried, gradually, the particular quality of genuine respect that Issei had learned to recognize in skilled combatants who encountered, finally, an opponent worthy of their full capability. "You are," Siegfried said during a brief pause as both combatants separated to reassess, breathing hard, considerably more than the reports suggested. "I begin to understand why Cao Cao found the dialogue with you worth pursuing rather than simply dismissing. I'm not trying to prove anything beyond what's actually true," Issei said, his own breathing controlled despite the intensity of the preceding exchange. "I just want this to end in a way that doesn't require either of us, or anyone else, to keep fighting after today." A noble sentiment. But sentiment did not win this contest, Seker Yudai. Strength will. Siegfried raised his sword again, the holy light along its blade intensifying to a degree Issei had not yet seen, and Issei felt, through the leyline bond, a warning sense of genuine, escalating danger, the recognition that Siegfried was preparing to commit fully to an attack that would test the absolute limits of what the agreed terms of the contest could safely contain. "Partner," Drake's voice came through with unusual urgency. "He intends a strike beyond what the contest's terms anticipated. If you do not match it fully, the consequences may exceed what either side intended." "Then let's match it," Issei said, and felt the leylines respond to his intention with the particular vast, patient generosity that had characterized the bond from its very first moment, 2 years before, on a stone platform in the Heart Grove, the territory's full strength flowing into him not as raw force alone but as the synthesis Azazel had spent months studying. Draconic fire and spiritual harmony woven together into something that was, in this moment, fully and completely realized. The boosted gear's jewel blazed with a light that outshone the morning sun, and Issei felt his own form shift, subtly but unmistakably, into something beyond even the enhanced state he had carried since the original ritual, scales of crimson and gold spreading further across his exposed skin, his eyes taking on the particular draconic quality that marked the full expression of the bond's power. The Senjutsu Dragon Emperor formed fully and completely manifest for the first time in actual combat. Rather than mere theoretical demonstration, Siegfried's attack came, the holy light of his blade gathering into something that radiated genuine, overwhelming power, and Issei met it not with simple defense but with the full, synthesized strength of 2 years of growth, the draconic force of the boosted gear and the ancient, patient power of Kyoto's ley lines combining into a single, unified response that met Siegfried's strike at the exact center of the valley with a concussive force that sent shockwaves rippling outward across the gathered crowd, observers bracing themselves against the sheer pressure of the colliding energies. For a long moment, the two forces held in perfect, suspended balance, holy light and draconic spiritual synthesis locked together in a contest that seemed, to the observers watching from a careful distance, to test the very fabric of the valley itself. Then, gradually, Issei's strength began to prevail, not through overwhelming force alone but through the particular quality the ley lines had always granted him, patience and precision applied with absolute focus, finding the exact point of leverage where Siegfried's attack, however powerful, could be redirected rather than simply overcome through brute force. The holy blade's strike, gradually but unmistakably, began to bend away from its intended target, the immense energy it carried channeled, through Issei's careful application of leyline-guided precision, harmlessly into the open sky above rather than into either combatant. Siegfried staggered, the exhaustion of having committed his absolute maximum effort finally catching up with him, and Issei, recognizing the moment for what it was, did not press the advantage toward anything beyond what the contest's terms required. He simply stood, breathing hard but steady, the Senjutsu Dragon Emperor form gradually receding back into its more contained, everyday expression, and extended a hand toward his opponent. "That's enough," he said. "You've proven what you needed to prove. I think we both have." Siegfried looked at the offered hand for a long moment, his expression carrying the particular complicated mixture of genuine respect and reluctant acknowledgement that Issei had learned, over 2 years of difficult diplomacy, to recognize as the beginning of a shift in someone's fundamental position, even when that shift remained incomplete. You could have pressed the advantage, Siegfried said, finally accepting the offered hand and allowing Issei to help him to his feet. The terms would have permitted it, given how far the engagement escalated beyond what either of us initially anticipated. I didn't come here to defeat you, Issei said. I came here to prove that this doesn't have to end in everyone fighting until someone's destroyed. I think we just did that. I think that matters more than whether I could have pushed further. Siegfried was quiet for a long moment, and across the valley, the gathered observers began, gradually, to relax from the tense stillness that had characterized the contest's climactic exchange, the recognition spreading through the crowd that the engagement had concluded without the catastrophic escalation many had feared. I withdraw my faction's objection to the continued pause, Siegfried said finally, his voice carrying a formal weight that Issei recognized as genuine, binding commitment rather than mere grudging concession. Not because I have abandoned my conviction that strength ultimately determines outcomes in this world, Hyoudou, but because you have demonstrated, today, a strength considerable enough that I find myself willing to extend the patience Cao Cao has asked of me, simply to see what an opponent of your capability builds with the time that patience provides. That's all I'm asking for, Issei said. Time. The chance to keep proving, through what we actually build, that there's a better path than the one your organization was founded around. Cao Cao approached as the gathered crowds began to disperse, his expression carrying a particular thoughtful satisfaction that Issei had come to associate, over the preceding months of careful dialogue, with the man's genuine engagement rather than mere diplomatic performance. That, Cao Cao said, was considerably more impressive than even my own intelligence had prepared me to expect. The Senjutsu Dragon Emperor form, fully manifest. I confess, even with months of dialogue and considerable study, I had not fully appreciated the scale of what you have actually become. I'm glad it was enough, Issei said. I really didn't want this to end any other way. Nor, I think, did I, though I would not have admitted that quite so plainly before today. Cao Cao's expression carried, for a moment, something that approached genuine warmth. The dialogue continues, Hyoudou. And I confess I find myself increasingly curious to see where it eventually leads, for both our organizations. Issei returned to where Kuroka and the Concordat representatives waited at the valley's edge, the exhaustion of the contest finally settling fully into his limbs now that the immediate tension had passed, and Kuroka met him with an expression that combined visible relief with the particular fierce pride that had become, over 2 years, one of the things he treasured most about her. You did it, she said simply, the words carrying more weight than their brevity suggested. We did it, Issei corrected gently. All of us. This was never just me. No, Kuroka agreed, taking his arm as they began the journey back toward Kyoto, the summer afternoon warm and bright around them, the valley behind them settling back into its ordinary, undisturbed quiet. It never was. And I think that, more than anything else, is exactly why it worked. Chapter 26. The months following the contest with Siegfried settled into a period that Shinra, reviewing the accumulated intelligence reports with the particular satisfaction of a man watching a long campaign finally bear sustainable fruit, began referring to as the Concordat's consolidation era. A stretch of relative peace in which the network's energy could be directed towards strengthening and refining what had already been built rather than constantly responding to fresh crises. Issei found himself, during this period, settling into a rhythm of life that felt, in its own way, as significant as any of the dramatic confrontations that had characterized the preceding 2 years. The early mornings spent tending the boundary wards, a practice that had become so thoroughly integrated into his daily existence that it required scarcely conscious effort any longer, the leylines responding to his attention with the easy familiarity of a long, settled partnership. The afternoons spent in increasingly varied work, sometimes diplomatic correspondence with Concordat member communities, sometimes training sessions with Kuoh, whose foxfire technique had developed, over 2 years, into something genuinely formidable, sometimes quiet research alongside Shinra in the archive, continuing the patient work of understanding both the territory's deep history and the evolving landscape of supernatural politics that the Concordat now had to navigate, and the evenings, increasingly, spent with all 3 of the people who had become, over 2 years, the absolute center of his life, Yasaka and Kuroka, and, as she grew older and increasingly included in matters of genuine substance, Kuno herself, the four of them having developed, gradually and without ever requiring dramatic negotiation, a particular rhythm of shared life that felt, to Issei, like exactly the kind of family he had not known, 2 years before, that he was capable of building. It was during one of these quiet evenings, the autumn air crisp and the maple leaves beginning their seasonal turn for the third time since his arrival, that Yasaka raised a subject that had clearly been weighing on her for some time. Issei, she said, the four of them settled together in the study, the evening's ordinary business concluded. I would like to discuss something. Not urgently, but with the seriousness it deserves. She glanced at Kuroka, who nodded slightly, the gesture suggesting the two of them had already discussed this between themselves before raising it with him directly. The question of formal recognition. Of what we have built together, the three of us, and how that recognition might matter, both personally and politically, given everything the Concordat has become. You mean marriage, Issei said, not quite a question, the particular directness that had characterized so much of his approach to significant matters over the preceding 2 years carrying him past any need for delicate circling of the actual subject. I mean exactly that, Yasaka confirmed, her expression carrying the particular warm seriousness she brought to matters that touched both her heart and her responsibilities as the Yokai faction's leader. The Yokai tradition, as I described to you on the night before the original ritual, has historically recognized the bond between guardian and leader as something that could deepen into formal partnership, when both parties chose it freely. I have chosen it, Issei, for some time now, though I have not pressed the matter, wanting you to arrive at your own readiness rather than feeling obligated by my own clarity on the subject. Issei felt the weight of this settle into him, not with surprise, exactly, because the depth of what existed between them had been clear and settled for a long time, but with the particular significant gravity of recognizing that a quiet, accumulated truth was now being named directly, formally, in a way that called for an equally direct and formal response. I've been ready for a while, he said. Honestly, I think I've been ready since sometime in that first year. I just wasn't sure how to bring it up, partly because I wanted to make sure it included Kuroka properly too, in whatever way made sense for the three of us, rather than feeling like an afterthought to something that had already been decided between you and me. Kuroka's expression, hearing this, carried the particular quiet warmth that had become, over the preceding year, increasingly frequent and increasingly unguarded, the transformation from the wary, exhausted woman he had found in the winter snow into someone who had built, alongside the family she had found here, a genuine and settled capacity for openly expressed feeling. I have thought about this as well, she said. And I want to say plainly, since we have always done best by simply being honest with each other rather than circling difficult subjects, that I do not need the same formal recognition that matters to Yasaka, given her position and the particular weight that tradition carries for her leadership. But I would like, if it is something the three of us can build together, some form of acknowledgement that what exists between us is equally real, equally chosen, regardless of whether it takes the same formal shape as what exists between you and Yasaka. Then let's figure out what that looks like, Issei said, together, in whatever way actually fits the three of us, instead of trying to force it into a shape that was designed for a different kind of relationship entirely. The conversation that followed, extending across that evening and several subsequent ones, eventually produced something that Shinra, when consulted about the practical and political implications, described with evident satisfaction as an arrangement without clear historical precedent, which he noted, with the particular dry humor that had become a comfortable feature of their working relationship, seemed entirely fitting given how much else about Issei's tenure, as Kyoto's guardian had defied existing precedent. A formal ceremony, conducted according to Yokai tradition, recognizing Yasaka and Issei's bond in the way the old rituals had always anticipated, the guardian and the leader joined not merely through the ley line bond itself but through the deeper, chosen commitment that bond had grown to encompass. And alongside it, a second, equally significant recognition, less bound by ancient precedent but no less genuine, acknowledging Kuroka's place within the family they had built, not as a secondary consideration but as someone whose presence, and whose chosen commitment mattered exactly as much, in its own distinct shape, as everything else the ceremony recognized. The ceremony itself, held in early winter nearly 3 years after Issei's arrival, drew guests from across the entire Concordat network, 9 communities now grown to 14 as the Alliance had continued its careful, deliberate expansion, representatives from the 3 factions including Sona, whose warm, genuine pleasure at the occasion carried the particular weight of someone who had watched, with real investment, the transformation of a former colleague's life into something this complete. Azazel attended with considerably less equipment than usual, having apparently decided, as he had for the anniversary gathering years before, that this particular occasion called for restraint rather than research. Even Venelana Gremory sent a formal but unmistakably warm gift and message, the careful diplomatic distance of their earlier interactions having softened, over years of continued positive engagement, into something approaching genuine friendship. Kuoh, now considerably grown from the small, curious child who had watched Issei sleep on his first morning in Kyoto into someone whose presence carried real, developing maturity alongside her continued enthusiasm, served as a central part of the ceremony itself, her role formally recognized within the proceedings as both Yasaka's daughter and, in the particular language the Yokai elders had carefully developed for the occasion, as family to all 3 of the people being formally bound together that day, standing at the center of the Heart Grove, the same clearing where the original leyline ritual had transformed him 3 years before, surrounded by the ancient cedars and the gathered weight of everyone who had become, 3 years of careful, patient building, his genuine chosen family. Issei felt the particular fullness of a moment that connected directly back to that first desperate, hopeful decision on a rain-soaked mountain path. 3 years and what felt, in the accumulated weight of everything built since, like an entire lifetime ago. 3 years ago, he said, during the portion of the ceremony reserved for his own words, addressing not merely Yasaka and Kuroka but the entire gathered community that had grown from that single original choice. I walked up this mountain because I didn't know where else to go, and because I couldn't stand watching someone get hurt without trying to help, even though I had no plan and honestly no idea what I was walking into. I found, at the top of that mountain, more than I could have imagined wanting, let alone receiving. A home. A purpose. A family that chose me as completely as I chose them. And now, standing here again, in this same clearing, I get to formally recognize everything that choice has grown into, with the 2 people who have made every single day of the past 3 years feel like exactly where I was always supposed to be. Yasaka's eyes were bright with unshed tears as he spoke, her expression carrying the particular complete warmth that had characterized so much of their relationships deepening over the preceding years, and Kuroka, standing beside her with her own composure carefully but visibly moved, reached out and took both their hands. The 3 of them joined together at the center of the grove where everything had originally begun. We built this together, Yasaka said, her voice carrying clearly across the gathered crowd. Not merely the 2 of us, or the 3 of us, but everyone here, every community that chose to trust in something genuinely new rather than accepting the isolation history had taught us to expect. What we recognize today is not merely a personal bond, though that bond is real and deeply cherished. It is the formal acknowledgement of everything this territory, this alliance, this family, has become, and everything it will continue to become, for as long as the years the leylines have granted us allow. The leylines themselves, deep beneath the Heart Grove, pulsed with their ancient, patient rhythm throughout the ceremony, the same vast, watchful presence that had first reached toward Issei 3 years before, now woven so thoroughly into the fabric of his existence that the distinction between guardian and territory had long since become, in every meaningful sense, simply one continuous, mutually sustaining whole. When the formal ceremony concluded and the celebration that followed stretched long into the winter evening, lanterns glowing warm against the gathering dark, Issei found himself, briefly, standing alone at the edge of the Heart Grove, looking back at the gathered warmth of everyone who had traveled, in one way or another, to be present for this moment. A long way from that rain-soaked mountain path, partner, Drake observed, his voice carrying the particular warm satisfaction that had become, over 3 years, an increasingly frequent feature of their bond. Yeah, Issei agreed softly, watching Kuoh laugh at something Sona's Peerage member had said, watching Kuroka and Yasaka deep in warm conversation with Hachiru and several other Concordat elders, watching the whole vast, accumulated weight of everything 3 years of patient, careful building had produced. A really long way, Drake. And I wouldn't trade a single step of the journey that got us here. Nor would I, partner, Drake said. Nor would I. The winter stars emerged clear and bright above the Heart Grove as the celebration continued, and somewhere in the vast, patient network of leylines beneath the mountain, the territory that had become, over 3 transformative years, so much more than anyone could have imagined on that first desperate night, continued its steady, ancient hum, carrying within it the accumulated warmth and strength of everyone who had chosen, freely and completely, to call this place home. Chapter 27. Spring returned to the mountains for the 4th time since Issei's arrival, and with it came a development that none of them, despite years of careful vigilance and strategic preparation, had fully anticipated, a request arriving through the Concordat's diplomatic channels not from a threatened community seeking alliance, nor from the 3 factions seeking continued cooperation, but from a delegation claiming to represent the hero faction itself, requesting a formal audience to discuss what the message described, with careful diplomatic restraint, as a matter of considerable mutual significance. This is new, Shinra said, examining the formal request with the particular careful attention he gave to anything that deviated from established patterns. The dialogue with Cao Cao has continued steadily over the past year, but always through the same careful, mediated channels we established initially. A direct formal request through Concordat diplomatic structures rather than Azazel's intermediary network suggests something has shifted in how Cao Cao's organization views its relationship to us. Do we know what they want to discuss? Issei asked. The message is deliberately vague on specifics, though it requests that you personally, along with appropriate Concordat representation, attend. Given the history of our engagement with Cao Cao, I would guess this represents either a genuine attempt at more formal, structured cooperation, or possibly news regarding internal developments within the hero faction that Cao Cao believes warrant direct communication rather than the gradual, careful dialogue we have maintained until now. Yasaka's expression carried the particular thoughtful consideration she brought to genuinely uncertain strategic developments. I believe we should accept the request, with appropriate caution but also with the recognition that the relationship we have built with Cao Cao over the past year has, by every measure available to us, proven genuinely valuable. If something significant has shifted within his organization, understanding it directly, rather than through second-hand intelligence, would serve us considerably better than caution alone. The meeting took place 2 weeks later, at the same neutral facility that had hosted both the original 3 factions consultation and the subsequent dialogue sessions with Cao Cao, and Issei arrived with Kuroka and a small delegation that included, for the first time, Hachiru and the Kitsune elder from Okayama. Yasaka having suggested that direct Concordat representation beyond Kyoto's own leadership might carry additional weight given the significance the meeting's careful vagueness suggested. Cao Cao met them with an expression that carried something Issei had not previously observed in their dialogue, a particular weariness layered beneath his usual composed bearing, the look of a man who had spent considerable energy on an internal struggle whose outcome remained genuinely uncertain. I will be direct, Cao Cao said, once the formal courtesies had been exchanged and the delegations had settled into the meeting room's careful arrangement. The dialogue we have maintained over the past year, and the demonstrated success of the Concordat's continued growth despite my organization's founding premise predicting its eventual failure, has produced exactly the kind of internal questioning I anticipated when I first agreed to engage with you, Sekirudai. That questioning has, in recent months, grown considerably more significant than I initially expected. What does that mean specifically? Issei asked. It means that a substantial faction within my organization, considerably larger than Siegfried's earlier descent, has begun openly questioning whether the hero faction's founding mission, the elimination of supernatural beings as a categorical response to historical injustice, actually serves the goals that originally motivated most of our members to join. Many came to this organization not from hatred of supernatural beings specifically, but from genuine grievance against systems of power that excluded and exploited ordinary humans, the same grievance, in many respects, that you yourself experienced within the Gremory Peerage before your departure. Chow Chow's expression carried the particular careful weight of someone articulating a genuinely difficult internal reckoning. The Concordat represents, to this growing faction, evidence that the actual solution to that grievance might lie not in elimination, but in exactly the kind of structural transformation you have spent 4 years demonstrating is possible. Building genuine alternatives to existing hierarchies, rather than attempting to destroy the hierarchies through force. The weight of this settled into the room with considerable significance, Issei absorbing the implications with the particular careful attention such a development warranted. "You're saying your organization might be fracturing," he said, "not because of external pressure, but because your own people are starting to agree with what we're trying to build. That is, in essence, an accurate summary, though the situation carries considerably more internal complexity than that summary alone suggests." Chow Chow's expression carried genuine, visible difficulty. "I find myself, Security, in a position I did not anticipate when our dialogue began. A meaningful portion of my own organization now advocates for a fundamental redirection of our mission, away from elimination and towards something closer to what you yourself have built, structural transformation through demonstrated alternative rather than destructive force. I have spent years building and unifying this organization around a singular, clear purpose. The prospect of that purpose itself shifting beneath me, however much the underlying logic might support such a shift, represents a genuinely difficult reckoning. What do you actually believe, now, after everything we've discussed and everything you've watched the Concordat build?" Issei asked, the question carrying genuine, careful weight rather than mere diplomatic positioning. Chow Chow was quiet for a long moment, and when he answered, his voice carried a particular honest vulnerability that Issei had not previously witnessed from him across their entire year of careful, measured dialogue. "I believe," he said slowly, "that you have demonstrated something I did not believe possible when our organization's founding members first articulated its mission. Genuine, voluntary cooperation between human and supernatural communities, built not on the supernatural being's continued dominance nor on humanity's violent elimination of that dominance, but on something considerably more complex and, I confess, considerably more hopeful. I believed, for most of my adult life, that the only path toward justice for the historical grievances my organization was founded to address required the elimination of an entire category of beings, regardless of the individual merit or innocence of any particular member of that category. You have shown me, through 4 years of demonstrated, sustained, replicable success, that this belief may have been, at minimum, incomplete, and possibly fundamentally mistaken." The room was very quiet following this admission, the weight of it settling fully into everyone present, Issei included. "What do you want to do about that?" Issei asked finally. "I am not yet certain," Chow Chow admitted. "But I believe, given the scale of the internal questioning my organization currently faces, that some form of fundamental transformation is approaching, regardless of my own personal readiness to fully embrace it. I requested this meeting, Security, not merely to inform you of this development, but to ask whether the Concordat, and you personally, would be willing to engage with what comes next. If my organization fractures, as seems increasingly likely, there will be considerable numbers of former hero faction members, some genuinely committed to the kind of transformation our dialogue has suggested is possible, others remaining committed to more traditional elimination-focused ideology, others simply uncertain and searching for direction amid an organization in genuine crisis. How that fracture resolves, whether it produces something constructive or something considerably more chaotic and dangerous, may depend significantly on whether there exists a genuine, viable alternative path for those members seeking one." Issei considered this with the particular careful weight such a momentous request deserved, recognizing in it both genuine opportunity and considerable risk. "I think," he said finally, "that if there are people within your organization who genuinely want to build something like what we've built, rather than continuing toward elimination, the Concordat should be willing to engage with that, carefully and with appropriate verification, the same way we've engaged with every other community that's approached us seeking alliance. But I want to be honest with you, Chow Chow. This isn't simple. Trust takes time to build properly, and given the history between the hero faction and the communities in our network, some of whom have lost people directly to your organization's previous campaigns, this would require considerable care, considerable patience, and probably considerable forgiveness on both sides that won't come easily or quickly. I would not expect simplicity, Cao Cao said. I would not have requested this meeting if I believed the path forward, whatever shape it ultimately takes, could be simple. The conversation that followed extended across the remainder of that day and well into the next, the careful, complicated work of beginning to imagine what a genuine transition might look like, how former hero faction members might be vetted and, where appropriate, integrated into the Concordat structures. How the considerable historical harm the organization had caused might be acknowledged and addressed rather than simply set aside in the interest of pragmatic alliance. How Cao Cao himself, regardless of the outcome for his broader organization, might continue the relationship with the Concordat that 4 years of careful, patient dialogue had built. Hachiru, who had remained largely quiet through much of the formal negotiation, spoke near its conclusion, his voice carrying the particular weight of someone whose own community's history with vulnerability and eventual alliance gave him genuine standing to address the matter directly. I lost people, he said, in the years before Issei first came to my valley. Friends, family, taken not by your organization specifically, Cao Cao, but by the same kind of ideology your organization was founded to represent. I will not pretend that history does not matter, or that it can simply be set aside because circumstances have shifted. But I will say this. The alliance Issei offered my community 4 years ago did not erase the harm we had already suffered. It simply ensured that harm would not continue indefinitely, unaddressed and unanswered. If genuine transformation is possible within your organization, if people who once pursued our elimination can become, instead, genuine partners in building something better, I believe that possibility deserves to be tested carefully, rather than dismissed simply because the history leading to this moment was difficult. Cao Cao received this with visible, genuine gravity. Thank you, he said. I do not take that grace for granted, and I do not believe my organization, whatever its eventual fate, has yet earned it fully. But I am grateful for the willingness to consider the possibility. They departed that evening with no final resolution, but with something considerably more significant than the meeting's careful initial vagueness had suggested might emerge, the beginning of an entirely new kind of diplomatic challenge, the careful, uncertain work of helping to midwife the transformation of a former enemy organization into something that might, eventually, become a genuine and meaningful addition to everything the Concordat had spent 4 years building. This is going to be harder than anything we've done before, Kuroka observed, as they made their way back toward Kyoto through the spring evening, the implications of what they had just discussed settling fully into both of them. Probably, Issei agreed. But I think it's worth trying. If we can actually help turn something built around elimination into something that contributes to what we're building instead, that's not just a win for us. That's proof that the whole approach actually works, on a scale we haven't tested yet. And if it fails? If the fracture within Cao Cao's organization produces something more dangerous rather than less, despite our best efforts? Issei considered this seriously, the particular weight of genuine uncertainty settling into him without overwhelming the steady, patient resolve the leylines had granted him. Then we'll deal with that the way we've dealt with every other challenge, he said. Together, carefully, and without giving up on the possibility that things can still get better, even when the path forward isn't certain. He looked at Kuroka, the spring stars beginning to emerge above the darkening mountains. That's basically been the whole approach since the very beginning, hasn't it? Not knowing for certain that it'll work, but trying anyway, because the alternative, giving up before even attempting it, has never actually felt like a real option. No, Kuroka agreed, taking his hand as they continued the journey home. It never has. Chapter 28. The fracture within the hero faction, when it finally occurred some 3 months after the meeting with Cao Cao, unfolded with considerably less chaos than Shinra's most pessimistic projections had feared, though it remained, even in its most orderly elements, a genuinely complicated and delicate process requiring careful management from every party involved. Cao Cao, after weeks of internal deliberation that Shinra's intelligence network tracked with careful, respectful distance, announced a formal restructuring of the organization, dividing its membership into those who wished to continue pursuing the original elimination-focused mission under new, separate leadership, and those who wished to pursue what he termed in language that carried unmistakable echoes of the dialogue he and Issei had maintained over the preceding year, a path of structural transformation rather than destruction. He's essentially splitting the organization in two, Shinra reported, reviewing the formal announcement that had reached them through Azazel's network. The traditionalist faction, numbering perhaps 60% of the original membership, will continue under Siegfried's leadership, maintaining the hero faction's name and its original elimination-focused mission, though apparently with somewhat diminished resources and, crucially, without Cao Cao's own considerable strategic capability directing it. And the other 40%? Issei asked. Cao Cao himself will lead what he is calling, for the present, simply the Reform faction, though Azazel suggests the name will likely evolve as the group's identity develops further. This faction explicitly seeks the kind of structural transformation our dialogue has discussed, building genuine alternative power structures rather than pursuing elimination, and Cao Cao has indicated, through the formal announcement, his intention to request formal engagement with the Concordat regarding potential integration or alliance. Yasaka's expression carried the particular careful weight of someone recognizing both genuine opportunity and considerable complexity in equal measure. This is, I believe, exactly the outcome we hoped for when this process began, though I confess I did not anticipate it would actually occur with this much apparent order and clarity. Siegfried retaining leadership of the traditionalist remainder is, in some respects, fortunate, given our prior direct engagement with him and the relationship, however limited, that engagement established. Will Siegfried's faction continue targeting the Concordat? Issei asked. Unclear, though Azazel's assessment suggests the traditionalist faction, weakened by the loss of nearly half its membership and most of its most capable strategic leadership, may lack the resources for the kind of large-scale coordinated action that originally seemed possible under Cao Cao's full unified leadership. This does not mean the threat has been eliminated entirely. But it suggests the immediate, large-scale danger has been considerably reduced, even as a longer-term, lower-intensity threat likely continues. The formal request from Cao Cao's Reform faction arrived within the week, proposing exactly the kind of careful, structured integration process the earlier dialogue had begun to imagine, individual members vetted through processes adapted from the Concordat's existing verification protocols, with Issei's particular sensitivity to deception. The ability he had developed and refined over the preceding 2 years, serving as one crucial layer of that verification alongside the more conventional diplomatic and intelligence-based approaches Shinra and Kuroka had developed. The process, when it began in earnest, proved exactly as complicated and labor-intensive as Issei had anticipated during that initial conversation in the spring. Each former hero faction member seeking integration required individual assessment, conversations conducted with the same patient, careful honesty that had characterized every significant diplomatic engagement of the preceding 4 years, an explicit accounting of their history within the organization, genuine acknowledgement of whatever harm their previous actions might have caused, and a careful, ongoing process of building trust with the Concordat communities they hope to eventually work alongside. This one troubles me, Kuroka said during one of the assessment sessions conducted in the 3rd month of the integration process, reviewing the file of a former hero faction operative whose history included direct involvement in operations against communities that had since become Concordat members. His sincerity, when I observed the conversation, seemed genuine. But genuine remorse and genuine safety are not always the same thing, particularly for someone whose combat training and operational history remain considerable, regardless of his current intentions. What does your assessment suggest, beyond the sincerity question? Issei asked. That he is genuinely seeking transformation, and that his combat capability, properly redirected, could be considerably valuable to the Concordat's defensive structure. But also that the communities he previously targeted deserve a voice in whether his integration proceeds, rather than having that decision made purely at the leadership level without their direct input. This insight, when raised with Shinra and eventually incorporated into the Concordat's broader integration protocols, produced what became, over the following months, one of the most significant structural innovations of the entire process. a formal mechanism by which communities directly affected by a particular former hero faction member's previous actions could participate meaningfully in decisions about that individual's eventual integration, either granting automatic veto power that might prevent genuine, deserved transformation, nor allowing leadership-level decisions to override the legitimate concerns of those who had suffered direct harm. The process was slow, often difficult, and occasionally produced outcomes that satisfied no one entirely. Individual cases where genuine remorse and genuine continued risk proved difficult to fully reconcile, where affected communities understandably struggled to extend trust regardless of how sincere a particular individual's transformation appeared to be. But across the months that followed, a clear pattern gradually emerged: the slow, patient accumulation of genuine successes, former hero faction members who, through sustained demonstrated commitment, gradually earned trust and integration into concordat structures, contributing their considerable skills, often combat training but sometimes intelligence gathering, strategic planning, or simply hard-won knowledge of the organization's remaining traditionalist operations, toward the broader network's continued strength. Cao Cao himself, throughout this extended process, remained a careful, engaged presence, attending regular consultations with Issei and the Concordat's broader leadership, his own integration into the network's structure handled with particular care given both his considerable capability and the symbolic weight his continued presence carried for the broader success or failure of the Reform faction's transition. I did not expect, Cao Cao admitted, during one such consultation held nearly 6 months into the integration process, the two of them walking together through the Heart Grove where Issei's original transformation had occurred years before, to find myself, at this stage of my life, essentially seeking the kind of guidance and structure I once believed only fools required. Having spent so many years believing my own strategic judgment sufficient for whatever challenges I encountered. I don't think it's about needing guidance, exactly, Issei said. I think it's just recognizing that building something genuinely good takes more than one person's judgment, no matter how capable that person is. I learned that pretty early on here, actually. Everything we've built, the Concordat, the Alliance network, none of it would exist if I'd tried to do it purely through my own strategic judgment, the way I might have tried back when I was still thinking like a raiding game piece instead of like, I don't know, an actual person building an actual community. Cao Cao considered this with the particular thoughtful gravity that had become, over the preceding year and a half of dialogue, an increasingly familiar feature of their relationship. You continue to offer perspective that I find genuinely valuable, Sekurudai, even now, well past the point where our relationship might reasonably be described as merely diplomatic necessity. A pause, and his expression carried something that approached, for perhaps the first time in their entire acquaintance, genuine warmth without any trace of strategic calculation. I consider you, if I may say so, something approaching a friend, despite the considerable distance our original positions might have suggested was possible. I'd say the same, Issei replied, and meant it completely. It's been a strange path to get here, honestly. But I'm glad it led to this. As am I, Cao Cao said, and the two of them continued their walk through the ancient grove in companionable, settled quiet, the leylines humming their patient, ancient song beneath their feet, carrying within their depths the accumulated weight of yet another transformation, another former adversary turned genuine ally, another piece of the slow, patient work of proving, through demonstrated success rather than mere theoretical argument, that the path Issei had stumbled onto 4 years before. Walking up a rain-soaked mountain with nothing but a duffel bag and a desperate hope, represented something genuinely capable of reshaping the broader landscape of supernatural politics, one careful, patient relationship at a time. By the time the integration process reached what Shinra eventually declared its first major milestone, nearly a year after the initial fracture, the Reform faction had been substantially absorbed into the Concordat's broader structure, its former members contributing meaningfully across every dimension of the network's continued operation, while Siegfried's diminished traditionalist remainder, lacking both Cao Cao's strategic capability and the considerable resources the fracture had cost them, had retreated into a posture of cautious, infrequent activity that Shinra's intelligence network continued to monitor carefully but that no longer represented the kind of existential, immediate threat the organization had once posed. We did it, Issei said, reviewing the milestone report with Yasaka and Kuroka in the study one evening, the particular satisfaction of watching a years-long process finally reach genuine, sustainable success settling warm and significant in his chest. We did, Yasaka agreed, her hand finding his beneath the table, the familiar warmth of the gesture carrying, after nearly 4 years, the particular comfortable certainty of a partnership that had only deepened with every challenge faced together. And I think, Issei, that what we have built here, in transforming not merely isolated communities into a thriving alliance network, but in transforming a former enemy organization into a genuine contributor to that same network, represents something I do not believe has historical precedent. We have not simply defended ourselves against the hero faction's threat. We have transformed the very source of that threat into something that strengthens rather than endangers everything we have built. That's the whole point though, isn't it? Issei said, looking at the two women who had become, over 4 transformative years, the absolute center of his life, and beyond them, in his mind's eye, the whole vast network of communities and alliances and former adversaries turned genuine friends that had grown from a single desperate decision on a rain-soaked mountain path. Not just surviving the threats that come at us, but actually changing what those threats become, given enough patience and enough genuine care. I think that's the thing I'm proudest of, out of everything we've built. Not that we got strong enough to defend ourselves. That we got wise enough to turn enemies into allies, instead of just enemies into corpses. Kuroka's expression, hearing this, carried the particular quiet warmth that had become, over the years since she'd first stumbled bleeding into Kyoto's boundary wards, an entirely settled and natural part of who she had become. You have always had that instinct, she said. Even from the very first night, when you found me in the snow and chose curiosity and care over suspicion and threat. I think, in many ways, everything we have built since has simply been that same instinct, applied at increasingly larger scales, until it reshaped an entire region's approach to supernatural conflict. Maybe, Issei said, smiling at her with the particular warmth 4 years of chosen love had built between them. Or maybe I just got really lucky, finding people who were willing to build something this good alongside me, instead of trying to do it all alone. Perhaps it is both, Yasaka said softly. The instinct, and the luck of finding people willing to meet it fully. I do not think either, alone, would have been sufficient to build what we have built. But together, Issei, they have proven more than enough. The evening settled into its familiar, comfortable warmth, the leylines humming steady and strong beneath the mountain, the territory and the alliance network it anchored continuing their patient, steady growth into something that, for years before, none of them could have fully imagined, and that now, standing at the center of it, felt like nothing less than the truest and most complete expression of everything Issei Hyoudou had once hoped, against considerable odds, that his life might still become. Chapter 29. 5 years to the day after Issei had first walked up the mountain path toward Kyoto, exhausted and humiliated and certain only of the fact that he could not remain somewhere that valued him only for the parts that were convenient, the Eastern Concordat held what had become, by long tradition, its most significant annual gathering, the assembled representatives of now 23 member communities. Along with formal delegations from all 3 factions and, in a development that would have seemed impossible at the Alliance's founding, a substantial contingent from what remained of Cao Cao's Reform faction, fully integrated now into the Concordat's broader structure. Issei stood at the edge of the gathering in the Heart Grove, the same ancient clearing where his transformation had first occurred, and found himself, as he increasingly did during these larger ceremonial occasions, taking a quiet moment to simply observe the scope of what had grown from that single, desperate choice 5 years before. Kuoh, now 16 in human terms though her yokai aging placed her somewhat differently, stood near the grove's center in formal attire, no longer merely observing the proceedings as a curious child but participating directly as a recognized junior representative of Kyoto's leadership, her fox fire technique having developed, under Kuroka's continued patient instruction, into something that several visiting Concordat elders had begun describing, with evident respect, as approaching mastery. Rare for her age even among the most gifted Kitsune lineages. Hachiru, visibly aged but carrying himself with the particular settled confidence of a leader whose community had not merely survived but genuinely thrived under the Concordat's protection, occupied a position of honor among the gathered elders, his valley having grown, over 5 years, into one of the network's most stable and contributing members, sending its own trained practitioners now to assist newer Concordat communities still in the early, vulnerable stages of alliance integration that his own people remembered all too well. Sona Citri, accompanied by a delegation that included several younger members of her peerage who had grown up, in some sense, alongside the Concordat's own development, exchanged warm greetings with Issei as the formal proceedings began, the easy friendship between them having deepened, over 5 years of consistent positive engagement, into something that occasionally prompted Issei to reflect on how strange and wonderful it was that this relationship, born from careful diplomatic necessity in the alliance's earliest days, had become simply and genuinely real. And at the center of it all, Yasaka and Kuroka stood together near the grove's ancient stone platform, the two of them having developed, over the years since their formal joining, a partnership and friendship of their own that extended well beyond their shared connection to Issei, the particular complex, generous architecture of their family having proven, across half a decade of genuine testing, considerably more durable and more naturally warm than anyone might have predicted on that first careful evening when they had sat together discussing what shape their relationship might take. Shinra, beginning the formal proceedings with the particular dry ceremony he had perfected over years of presiding over the Concordat's annual gatherings, reviewed the network's accumulated achievements with evident, restrained satisfaction. 23 member communities, spanning a geographic range that had grown, over 5 years, to encompass significant portions of the Kansai, Chugoku, and Shikoku regions, with preliminary contact established, in recent months, with isolated supernatural communities as far afield as Kyushu. A formal, sustainable relationship with all 3 factions, built not on subordination but on genuine mutual respect and benefit. The successful, if difficult, integration of a substantial portion of a former enemy organization into productive, contributing membership, and perhaps most significantly, a demonstrated, replicable model for transforming isolated vulnerability into collective strength, a model that, Shinra noted with particular satisfaction, had begun attracting genuine scholarly and diplomatic interest from supernatural communities and factions well beyond the Concordat's own direct membership. Curious whether similar structures might be built in other regions facing similar historical patterns of isolation and exploitation. 5 years ago, Shinra said, his voice carrying clearly across the assembled gathering, a single act of courage on a rain-soaked mountain path set in motion a transformation that none of us, even those of us who witnessed its earliest moments, could have fully anticipated. We gather today not merely to celebrate what has been built, though that celebration is genuinely deserved. We gather to recommit ourselves to the patient, ongoing work of continuing to build it, because the work, as our guardian has reminded us many times across these 5 years, is never truly finished. There will always be new communities facing the same isolation we once faced. There will always be new challenges requiring the same patient, careful response that has carried us this far. And there will always, I believe, be the same fundamental choice that started all of this, the choice to refuse walking past someone in need, regardless of the personal cost that choice might carry. When the formal proceedings concluded and the gathering shifted into its more relaxed, celebratory register, Issei found himself approached by a delegation he had not expected, 3 representatives from a small community of Yuki-Ana and other snow spirits from the mountains near Niigata, communities that had, until recently, maintained the same isolated, vulnerable existence that had characterized the Yokai faction's situation 5 years before. We have heard, their elder said, her voice carrying the particular careful formality of someone approaching a significant request, of what the Eastern Concordat has built. Our own community has faced increasing pressure in recent months, from sources we believe connect to the same broader pattern your network has spent years addressing. We would like to formally request consideration for alliance, if such consideration remains available to communities beyond your network's current geographic range. Issei felt the particular warm satisfaction that had characterized so many similar moments across the preceding 5 years, the recognition that the work, however much had already been accomplished, remained genuinely ongoing, genuinely needed, the network's growth representing not an endpoint but simply the continued extension of something that, he had come to understand, might never reach a final, complete conclusion, and that this, rather than being discouraging, represented exactly the kind of meaningful, sustained purpose he had once, desperately, hoped his life might somehow contain. "We'd be honored to consider it," he said. "Let's talk properly, and figure out what your community actually needs, and how the Concordat might be able to help provide it." As the evening deepened into the particular warm, settled darkness that autumn brought to the mountains, lanterns glowing across the Heart Grove and the wider shrine grounds beyond it, Issei found himself, briefly, alone with Yasaka and Kuroka near the ancient stone platform, the three of them watching the gathered celebration with the particular contentment that came from witnessing, directly, the accumulated fruit of years of patient, careful work. "Another community," Kuroka observed, watching the Yuki Ana delegation continue their conversation with several Concordat elders. "The work never quite stops, does it?" "No," Issei agreed. "I don't think it's supposed to. I think that's kind of the whole point. We're not building towards some moment where everything's finished and we get to stop. We're building something that just keeps growing, keeps including more people who need what we can offer, for as long as we're able to keep offering it." "And does that feel like a burden?" Yasaka asked, her tone carrying genuine curiosity rather than concern, the question of someone deeply familiar with both the weight and the reward of sustained, long-term responsibility. Issei considered this seriously, checking, as he had learned to do over 5 years of practice, whether the easy answer was also the true one. "No," he said finally. "Honestly, it feels like exactly what I wanted, even back before I knew what to call it. Back in Kuoh, I used to think the problem was that nobody listened to my ideas, that I just needed someone to actually value what I had to offer. But I think the real problem was that I didn't have anything yet that was actually mine to build, that I cared about enough to keep building even when it got hard. Now I do. All of this." He gestured toward the gathered celebration, the lanterns, the assembled communities and allies and former enemies turned genuine friends. "This is mine to keep building, for as long as I'm here to build it. And honestly, given how long that might actually be, I think that's about the best possible thing I could have ended up with." Yasaka's expression, hearing this, carried the particular deep, settled warmth that 5 years of partnership had built into something entirely unguarded, entirely complete. "I think," she said softly, "that this territory, this alliance, this family we have built together, could not have asked for a more fitting guardian than the one it found, quite by chance, on a rain-soaked mountain path 5 years ago." "It wasn't entirely chance," Kuroka said, with the particular dry warmth that had become, over the years, one of her most treasured qualities. "Issei has always had a particular gift for finding exactly the people and places that needed him most, even when he himself had no plan beyond simply refusing to look away from someone in trouble. I do not think that is chance, precisely. I think it is simply who he has always fundamentally been, even before any of us recognized it fully." "I'll take that," Issei said, smiling at both of them, the particular complete warmth of the moment settling fully into his chest. 5 years. I don't think I could have imagined any of this, that first rainy night, walking up this mountain with absolutely no idea what I was walking into. And yet, Yasaka said, "Here we are." "Here we are," Issei agreed, and the three of them stood together at the edge of the Heart Grove, watching the gathered celebration of everything 5 years of patient, careful, courageous building had produced, the leylines humming their ancient, steady song beneath the mountain, carrying within their depths the accumulated weight and warmth of a story that had begun with a single act of refusing to walk past someone in need, and that continued, even now, even with so much already built, to grow into something larger, something more inclusive, something more genuinely hopeful than any of them could have imagined possible on that first transformative night. The stars emerged clear and bright above the Heart Grove as the celebration continued long into the evening, and somewhere in the vast, patient network of alliances and chosen family and transformed adversaries that had grown from Kyoto's ley lines outward across an entire region, the steady, ongoing work of building something genuinely good in the world continued, one community, one relationship, one courageous choice at a time. Exactly as it had from the very beginning, and exactly as it would. Issei felt certain, standing there surrounded by everyone and everything he had come to love, continue for as long as the centuries the leylines had granted him allowed. It was, in every way that mattered, exactly enough. It was, in every way that mattered, everything. The sovereign of Kyoto had found, at the top of a single desperate mountain climb 5 years before, not merely power or purpose or even love, though all of those had come to him in abundance beyond anything he could have imagined. He had found, simply and completely, the truest version of who he had always been capable of becoming, given finally the chance, the trust, and the genuine, chosen family to become it fully. And as the autumn night deepened over the mountains, the leylines hummed on, patient and ancient and entirely alive, carrying forward, into whatever centuries still lay ahead, the steady, accumulating warmth of a story that had only just begun. Chapter 30. In the quiet weeks following the 5th anniversary gathering, as the Concordat began the careful, deliberate work of evaluating the Yuki Onna community's requests and several others that had arrived in its wake, Issei found himself drawn, increasingly, into a different kind of reflection. One that Yasaka had gently encouraged him toward during a quiet evening at the Kuoh Town not long after the celebration had concluded. "You have spent 5 years," she said, building outward. "The Concordat, the alliances, the transformation of former enemies into genuine partners. I wonder, Issei, whether you have given equal attention to what all of that building has meant for you personally, beyond the satisfaction of the work itself." Issei considered this seriously, recognizing in the question something that deserved more careful thought than his usual quick, instinctive answers typically provided. "I think," he said slowly, "I've been so focused on building something that mattered, something that would actually last and help people, that I haven't really stopped to think about who I've become in the process. Like, I know I'm different from the person who walked up this mountain 5 years ago. But I haven't really sat with what that difference actually means, beyond just, having more power and more responsibility. Then perhaps that is worth sitting with now," Yasaka said gently. "Not because anything is wrong, Issei. Simply because growth deserves to be witnessed and understood, not merely accumulated without reflection." He thought about it properly over the following days, the particular quiet, patient attention the leylines had taught him to bring to matters that deserved genuine consideration rather than quick resolution. He thought about the boy who had walked out of the Gremory clubroom 5 years before, exhausted and humiliated, certain only that he could not remain somewhere that valued him only for the parts that were convenient. That boy had been talented, certainly, brave in the specific, immediate way that led him to leap into danger without hesitation when someone needed help. But he had also been, Issei recognized now with the particular clarity that distance and growth provided, deeply uncertain of his own worth beyond his usefulness to others, someone who had absorbed, across 2 years in Kuoh, the quiet lesson that his value was measured entirely by what he could provide rather than by who he actually was. The man who stood now at the center of a thriving alliance network, who had negotiated with ancient devil nobility and persuaded a warrior bent on ideological elimination to reconsider decades of conviction, who had built, alongside 2 remarkable women, a family grounded in genuine chosen love rather than obligation or convenience. That man had learned, gradually and through considerable difficulty, to understand his own worth as something inherent rather than merely instrumental. The power he had gained, the Senjutsu Dragon Emperor form, the leyline bond's vast and patient strength, all of it mattered considerably less, he realized, examining the question honestly, than the simple, hard-won knowledge that he was worth loving and worth trusting regardless of what he could provide in any given moment. "I think the biggest difference," he told Kuroka, during a quiet morning walk along the boundary wards, the autumn air crisp and the leaves overhead turning toward their seasonal gold, "isn't really about power at all. It's that I used to think I had to earn my place everywhere I went, prove I was useful enough to deserve being there. Now I know I belong here. Not because of what I can do. Just because this is where I'm supposed to be, and these are the people I'm supposed to be with." Kuroka considered this with the particular thoughtful attention she brought to matters of genuine significance. "I understand that shift more than perhaps anyone else could," she said. "I spent years believing my own worth was contingent, conditional, that I had to constantly justify my continued existence through usefulness or through staying perpetually out of everyone's way. Finding this place, Finding you and Yasaka and Kuoh taught me the same lesson you are describing, though I suspect we each arrived at it through somewhat different paths. Do you ever think about what would have happened, Issei asked, if I hadn't found you in that clearing? If you just kept running, the way you'd been running for 2 years before that? Kuroka was quiet for a long moment, the question clearly touching something she had considered, in private, many times before. I think, she said finally, that I would have continued running until something eventually caught up with me, whether the hero faction directly or simply the accumulated exhaustion of never allowing myself to rest anywhere long enough to be truly safe. I do not think that path would have ended well, Issei. I am grateful, more than I think I have ever fully expressed, that you happened to be tending those boundary wards on exactly the morning I crossed them. I'm grateful too, Issei said. For all of it. The whole 5 years, even the genuinely terrifying parts, the hero faction assault, the contest with Siegfried, all of it. I wouldn't trade any of it, because all of it led here, to exactly this. They continued their walk in comfortable silence, the boundary wards humming their familiar, steady song as Issei's awareness moved across them with the easy, practiced attention of 5 years of daily tending, and it was during this quiet, ordinary moment, rather than during any of the dramatic confrontations or significant diplomatic breakthroughs that had characterized so much of the preceding years, that Issei found himself experiencing what he would later describe to Yasaka as a kind of settled, complete clarity about everything his life had become. He was not merely the Sekyuryudai any longer, defined by a sacred gear he had carried since adolescence without ever fully choosing it. He was not merely a former Devil Peerage member, defined by an institution that had, in the end, valued him only conditionally. He was the Senjutsu Dragon Emperor, guardian of Kyoto, husband to Yasaka and partner to Kuroka, father in every meaningful sense to Kuoh, architect alongside Shinra of an alliance network that had transformed the security and dignity of dozens of communities across an entire region, and friend, genuinely and surprisingly, to a man who had once led an organization dedicated to eliminating beings exactly like him. All of these identities, layered and accumulated across 5 transformative years, did not compete with each other for primacy. They simply coexisted, the way the draconic fire and the leylines' patient harmony coexisted within his own bonded soul, different aspects of a single, integrated whole that had grown, through patient and deliberate effort, into something considerably more complete than any single identity alone could have produced. That evening, gathering with Yasaka, Kuroka, and Kuoh for their familiar ritual of shared dinner and quiet conversation, Issei found himself sharing the reflection that the day's walk had crystallized within him. I think I finally understand something, he said, that I've been sort of circling for the past 5 years without ever quite landing on it directly. Back in Kuoh, I thought the problem was that nobody valued my ideas, that I just needed someone to actually listen to my strategic thinking instead of dismissing it. But that wasn't really the problem. The problem was that I didn't know my own worth wasn't dependent on whether my ideas got listened to in the first place. I needed people to value me unconditionally before I could really believe that my contributions, when they came, actually mattered for their own sake rather than as some kind of desperate proof of my usefulness. Yasaka's expression, hearing this, carried the particular deep warmth of someone witnessing a loved one articulate a truth she had long recognized in him but had wisely allowed him to discover for himself, in his own time, rather than simply telling him directly. That is, I think, one of the most important things anyone has ever said to me in this study, she said softly. And I am deeply glad, Issei, that you have arrived at it through your own reflection, rather than through any words I or anyone else might have offered you directly. Kuoh, listening with the particular careful attention she had developed over the years from simply being included in conversations that mattered, spoke with the directness that had always characterized her best qualities. I think that's true for me too, she said. I used to think I needed to get strong enough to prove I deserved to help protect everyone. But actually, I think I already belonged here, already mattered, even before I could do any of the things I can do now. The training just let me do more with the belonging I already had. That's exactly it, Kuoh, Issei said, looking at her with the particular pride that had grown, over the years, into something he felt as naturally and completely as he felt anything else in his life. You said that better than I did, honestly. The dinner continued in its familiar warmth, the conversation drifting, as it often did, across the practical matters of the Concordat's continued growth, the Yuki Onna community's pending integration, Kuna's latest training developments, the small, ordinary pleasures and challenges of a life that had grown, across 5 years, into something Issei treasured completely. And beneath all of it, the leylines hummed their ancient, patient song, carrying within their depths the accumulated warmth of a family and a territory and an alliance network that had grown, through patient and deliberate care, from a single desperate act of refusing to walk past someone in need into something that would, Issei felt certain, continue growing and strengthening and including more people who needed exactly what it offered. For as long as the centuries the bond had granted him allowed him to continue tending it, the work was never truly finished. He understood that now, completely and without any trace of the discouragement that understanding might once have carried. The work was not supposed to finish. It was supposed to continue, patiently and deliberately, exactly as it had from the very first night on that rain-soaked mountain path, carrying forward into however many centuries the ley lines had granted him, the steady, accumulating warmth of a life built not on power for its own sake, but on the simple, profound choice to keep refusing to walk past someone in need, for as long as he possibly could. It was, he thought, settling into the familiar warmth of his family's company as the autumn evening deepened outside the study's open screens, exactly the life he had once, desperately, and without any real hope of it coming true, wished he might somehow find. He had found it. And he intended, for every year the centuries still held in store for him, to keep building it, one patient, deliberate choice at a time.